After 2 failed marriages, single mom Rhonda Heaton of Hayden, Colorado, was feeling a bit discouraged. But that wasn't about to stop the 43-year-old dental assistant from looking for love.
When you get married, you expect to get married and stay married. And with already having been married twice, it really put a little pressure on me to think, I really want to do this forever.
So in the fall of 2005, Rhonda jumped into the online dating pool.
I started reading the profiles and looking at pictures. I was looking for someone who was very honest, caring and giving, someone that wasn't a drinker or a smoker.
Suddenly, Rhonda was drawn to the photo of a familiar-looking 51-year-old man named Robert Cash, a clerk at her neighborhood grocery store.
And I said, oh my gosh, I know who that is. I had seen him in the past and had noticed that he was always really bubbly at work.
Never one to wait, Rhonda left her phone number at the store for Bob, and a couple of days later, the two were sitting down at a restaurant to enjoy their first date.
He was just kind of old school and, like a gentleman from, back when they would open the doors for you.
And at over 6 feet tall, Bob was just Rhonda's type.
I've always been attracted to tall men, and so he was tall and, medium build.
As the two opened up to each other, Rhonda noticed some fun coincidences.
I had mentioned that I like motorcycles, and he had actually bought the motorcycle I was looking to purchase. And then I looked over at him, and we're both picking our tomatoes off of our sandwich exactly at the same time.
Rhonda shared that she was twice divorced with 2 teenage daughters, as Bob explained why he was single with no children.
He had told me that he was a caretaker for his mother. He was living in the same home where his mother had passed away the year before.
I was her caregiver.
I thought that was wonderful. Somebody that would devote their life to taking care of their parents.
But the clincher for Rhonda was when Bob told her he didn't drink.
Sorry about that.
I was really glad to hear that.
I don't drink.
Once I dated a young man that had a severe drinking problem, so I was looking for someone that didn't have those issues.
As the date ended, Rhonda couldn't help but feel she'd landed herself a keeper. And the feeling grew as the relationship took off at warp speed.
My mom was walking on water. I remember she'd come home every day, happier than ever. She was head over heels. She was in love.
So in November of 2005, 2 months and 2 days from their first date, Rhonda and Bob headed to the courthouse to make their union official.
We did it on the sly. I didn't even tell my children. It was kind of exciting.
I felt it was rushed. It was a surprise, not knowing, but she could talk about nothing other than how happy she was.
The newlyweds were excited to start their new life together. So Rhonda and her daughters moved to Bob's house in Steamboat Springs, 24 miles away, to turn his bachelor pad into a sweet family home. Everything seemed perfect until the holidays came around.
Bob's sister had invited us over for Thanksgiving. They were having wine with the meal, and Bob's sister had asked Bob if he wanted a glass. And I said, Bob doesn't drink. And there was a very dead calm in the room. I could feel the awkwardness in the air. And then it just kind of got left at that.
But Rhonda couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on.
I thought, what do they know that I don't know?
And soon she would find out her new husband had some secrets.
She was scared to go back to the house. Something didn't feel right.
I was devastated. Things were spiraling out of control.
In November of 2005, after a stilted introduction to her new husband Bob's family, Rhonda Heaton focused on building a new life as a couple.
I thought that this was the one, and you always hope that's the person you'll be with until you die. Thought that was what I had found.
But just a few months into their marriage, Rhonda started to notice how her teetotaling husband had begun drinking.
He started bringing beer into the home, which, normally is not cause for concern. However, I had made it clear I didn't want to be with someone that drank.
When Rhonda asked him about it, Bob dismissed the occasional beer as just something to take the edge off a hard day at work.
I didn't want to make a big thing out of it, and I kind of took it on initially as it was more my problem than his because I was not comfortable with it.
But over the next few years, after Rhonda's daughters moved out on their own, Bob's drinking was getting out of control.
I would drive the vehicle and look for my sunglasses and find alcohol hidden in the glove box. And when I asked him why he was hiding alcohol, he said, well, sometimes I have a bad day at work and I need a drink before I come home. It concerned me because drinking and driving is so dangerous.
And Rhonda slowly watched her once loving husband become a belligerent bully.
He was very complimentary in the beginning, and then he was saying how fat I was or comments that were rude. It just was so out of character from what I thought he was like.
But the final nail in the coffin came in March of 2010.
Bob lost his job at the grocery store. We were in the middle of a pretty significant recession in the United States, and it was difficult for Bob to get another job. So the loss of that income, however modest it was, it put a strain on their relationship.
Now, Rhonda was the sole provider.
He was sitting at home drinking, and each day that I would come home from work, he would be more and more drunk. He wasn't talking to me about what was happening. It did hurt me. But I was hoping that maybe if he could seek help and get better, that maybe we could work through it, and I didn't want to be divorced again.
So Rhonda reached out to Bob's family for help. Little did she know just how eye-opening that would be.
I called his sister and said, there's a problem. I'm not getting through to him. That is when I found out that he had problems with alcohol in his past. And she said he has always had a drinking problem.
The family's awkward reaction at Thanksgiving now made sense to Rhonda. And it got worse. Rhonda was floored to learn that the story Bob had told her about taking care of his dying mother was a classic spin job.
His sister did say that Bob wasn't actually taking care of his mother, that his mother was actually taking care of him.
And now Rhonda was doing the same thing. Her huge-hearted husband was nothing more than a giant liar.
I don't believe in lying whatsoever. This was not the man I thought I had married, and it was time to go ahead and get out of the relationship.
So in April of 2010, after 4 years of marriage, Rhonda filed for divorce.
I felt bad for my mom. It was another marriage, another relationship, another man who had let her down.
And with Bob unemployed, Rhonda was unable to keep up with the mortgage payments on her own. So they had no choice but to put the house on the market.
I didn't really have anywhere to go, and Bob said that he didn't have anywhere to go either, and neither of us had financial means to move out of the home. So we ended up having to stay in the house together.
But in the weeks that followed, Rhonda's wise fiscal choice would cost her dearly when Bob decided to take matters into his own hands.
Nobody really thought he would do what he did.
He planned to do it step by step.
And I said, oh my God, get the ambulance, get the police.
In April of 2010, Rhonda Heaton filed for divorce from her husband Bob and waited for their home to sell.
I started sitting in my car in the parking lot after work, until it was time to come home to go to bed because I didn't want to be in the home with him because he started having kind of peculiar behavior. He would follow me around the house as I did things and not ever be saying anything, just following me the whole time. I told the real estate agent that was selling our home, "You need to get me out of this house."
So Rhonda was grateful to her friend Jim when in June he offered to let her stay at his place in Vegas for a few days. But when Rhonda returned, Bob was waiting.
He was upset with me that I hadn't told him exactly where I went, but we were already filed for a divorce, so we weren't in a relationship.
Then one night when Rhonda came home from work, she got on the phone with Jim.
He was very concerned about me being in the home and thought it would be best if I didn't stay there, but I didn't have anywhere that I could go.
Rhonda thanked her friend, then glanced up to see Bob standing there.
Bob overheard me, and at the end of the phone call, I have a habit of saying "I love you" to my friends, and I think he mistook the way that I said it.
A few hours later, Rhonda crawled into bed, emotionally drained and ready for a good night's sleep. But at 6:30 a.m., Rhonda awoke to a shocking situation.
I heard the bedroom door open, and I could hear him walking into the room. And before I got a chance to ask him why he was in the room, I felt some type of impact. And I wasn't sure what was happening, because in my mind, I was thinking there's an intruder. And I said, "Bob, what was that?"
His answer shook her to the core.
And I said, "Oh my God, get the ambulance, get the police." And then he said, "No." And I said, "Why?" And he says, "I want you to die." And that's when I realized what exactly had happened, that he had shot me in the back. I couldn't feel my hands at all. I couldn't feel from the knee down. He was pacing up and down in the room, and he was yelling and screaming at me. Just screaming at the top of his lungs.
Bob turned and left the room, leaving Rhonda bleeding in her bed alone. The man who'd once taken Rhonda's breath away was now trying to take her life away.
Rhonda said, "I don't want to die." Within seconds, a shot was fired.
And he says, "There's no going back now."
If you have a story for Who the Bleep and would like to appear on the series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On the morning of June 11th, 2010, Rhonda Heaton lay frozen in shock and fear after her husband Bob Cash shot her in the spine and left her to die.
I laid there and tried to decide, what am I going to do? I wasn't able to move, and I was watching the clock.
Suddenly, Bob returned.
Bob was coming in the room every 20 to 30 minutes and say the same thing.
Are you dead yet?
Every time he came in the room, I held my breath. I just kept telling myself, dead people don't move, and dead people don't breathe. I had so many thoughts. I just knew I couldn't leave this with my kids to live with, seeing their mother die this way.
Almost 2 hours after shooting Rhonda, Bob came in to check on her once again.
And he took my pulse on my neck. And I just kept praying that I was far enough gone that it wouldn't register. And I just held my breath. And he says, "Well, I guess you're dead now."
Bob left the room again, and before long, Rhonda heard a sharp pounding at the door. Her co-workers, concerned when she didn't show up for work, had called the police.
It was pounding so hard. And I thought, this is it. They're going to come get me now, and it will be all right.
A few moments later, a shot rang out.
The officers didn't know where the shot was fired at, where it came from, but at that point they retreated to a secure location and called for backup.
A SWAT team arrived, and within minutes they burst through the doors. They found Rhonda clinging to life.
Surprisingly, she was talking and obviously very upset, but still, it's surprising to see somebody with a gunshot wound to the back and still being able to function.
Police discovered Bob in the other bedroom, barely alive. The gunshot they heard was Bob shooting himself.
He had a very obvious gunshot wound to his chest, right over his heart. The gun was laying on the bed next to him, near his hand.
Rhonda and Bob were taken to the nearest hospital. Inside the house, police discovered a series of notes Bob left, including one that began with, "Just lost it."
And he goes on saying why he lost it, what he heard on the phone call. He heard Rhonda say, "I love you." He said, "I lost my house, I lost my wife, I lost my job, I lost everything. I don't want to start again." I guess that was his confession.
Unbelievably, they both survived. And after painful surgery to remove the bullet near her spine, Rhonda walked out of the hospital just 3 weeks later. In 2012, Bob was made to stand in front of a jury. Finally, Rhonda came face to face with the man who tried to take her life.
It was terrifying. That was the first time since I had got shot that I was in the same room, and I didn't want to see him or hear his voice.
When Bob took the stand, he surprised everyone by claiming the shooting was an accident.
Bob testified that he was going to try and commit suicide in Rhonda's bedroom, but the gun accidentally went off inside the bedroom and it shot Rhonda. He kind of summed it up like, "I don't know how the gun went off, it just accidentally went off."
But the jury didn't buy it. Bob was convicted of attempted first-degree murder, and in April 2012, he was sentenced to 38 long years in prison.
He planned to do it step by step. Every action he took was planned. That is pure evil.
Bob was very cruel and unfeeling. Didn't seem to bother him that he was killing someone. And I live every day remembering. I don't ever stop remembering it.
Today, Rhonda still struggles with the aftermath of Bob's torture.
I don't like to have my back towards the door. I don't drive very far because I start having severe panic attacks. I don't trust people like I used to. If somebody you married is capable of this, what is everybody else capable of?
Even though she still bears scars, Rhonda doesn't let them define her.
I call it putting it on a shelf. It never goes away, ever. But you try to put it on a shelf because you have to keep going. You just make a new life.
My mom has a set of wings, and if you let them go, she'll fly. She's an amazing person. It makes your heart so happy.
In the summer of 1989, Kathleen Clark was busy climbing the corporate ladder as a stockbroker in Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
I was just 22 and the world was my oyster, wasn't looking really to get married or even be in a relationship or anything like that.
But all that changed when she met a handsome coworker named Bruce Steinman.
Bruce was very shy and quiet, just a polite, kind, easygoing person. One day he wrote me a note asking to go out to lunch. It was kind of cute that he had written a note. I was like, sure.
As the two chatted over lunch, Kathleen found herself intrigued by her date.
He just had an air about him that was different than other guys. It felt like he really wanted to woo me and impress me. We started doing everything together.
It was a whirlwind romance, and after 6 months of dating, Kathleen had no doubts when Bruce popped the question. Almost 2 years later, Kathleen and Bruce tied the knot on a gorgeous beach in Maine.
It was a beautiful day. I was very, very happy. All my friends were with me. It was an awesome, awesome day.
I could see how happy she was. They looked great together. It was just like a match made in heaven.
The happy couple settled down in a tiny New Hampshire town just 40 miles outside of Boston.
It was great. Bruce got a job that he liked in computer technology sales. I was thrilled with my new house. We had a really nice life.
5 years later, the two were overjoyed when they welcomed a son into the world.
We were very happy. Bruce was an awesome, awesome dad. He loved having a son, and he was very helpful.
They were always together. I definitely thought that they were the perfect American family.
Over the next 13 years, Kathleen kept the home fires burning, while Bruce's job in IT sales sent him on regular travel.
Bruce was gone more than he was home. But it was okay, it didn't bother me. You just get used to it. Our son and I were both very happy when Bruce would be coming home.
But by the spring of 2011, whenever Bruce was around, Kathleen found it harder and harder to keep his attention.
Bruce always liked his cell phone, but it became like almost an obsession. One night, we were at a friend's house for dinner, and the guys always go outside, and Bruce didn't even go out with him. He just stayed in the house, sitting on the couch, doing something on his phone. It became almost an embarrassment for me, to the point that I would say to him, "What are you doing on the phone?"
I'm just checking some work emails, but I just needed a few more minutes.
And after Bruce took on a new job, Kathleen noticed more bizarre behavior from her husband.
Bruce was still working with government sales, but he was going at least twice a month to the DC area. Right around that time, he started being very nitpicky with me over everything. One morning I came down and he had every cabinet, every drawer, everything wide open in the kitchen. And I knew that he didn't like that I didn't close the doors completely shut, but it was creepy to come down and see that he had done that. It was just odd behavior over insignificant things. And when I tried to talk to him about it, he would just pass it off. I'm under a lot of stress at work. So I'm like, maybe he is. I just didn't know what was going on with him. But I knew something was wrong.
And Kathleen would soon discover the sweet, affable man she married was really a cold-hearted snake.
There was something sinister going on.
He launched an attack. There was nothing that this man wouldn't do.
I was terrified. I knew my marriage was in trouble, but I never imagined that my son and I were in danger.
By the fall of 2011, Kathleen Steinman's happy 20-year marriage to her husband Bruce had taken a strange and disturbing turn.
I really had no idea what was causing the change. He was constantly on the phone. All of a sudden, it was like I couldn't do anything right. I couldn't say anything right. It just became very tense to be around him.
Kathleen told me that Bruce got very demanding. I just thought that they were going through a rough patch.
Soon, the tension between the Steinmans was unbearable.
When I would hear the car pull in, I could feel my stomach drop. I'm like, oh, he's home now. So I just stayed away because I knew he was going to try to find something to pick a fight with me about. Like, he'd walk in one door, I'd go out the other.
And Kathleen's friends noticed the change in Bruce, too.
I did have one friend who said maybe he's having an affair. But Bruce was very, quiet, not really an outgoing guy. I just never, ever imagined him ever having an affair.
But 2 days before Christmas, Kathleen had her first inkling that maybe her husband was hiding a secret.
I was down in the kitchen and his phone happened to be on the counter. And it buzzed and he had gotten a text and it just said, "Not sure if I'm going to be here."
Kathleen noticed the text was from a woman named Victoria.
It wasn't a name that I recognized. I just saw the text and thought, oh my God, is that a woman? Maybe he really is having an affair. So I took it upstairs and just handed him the phone and said, "You've got a text, are you having an affair?" And he said, "Of course not."
No, but it's not.
I said, "Then who is the text from?"
Bruce humbly admitted that Victoria was a stripper friend of his buddy's, letting them know she wouldn't be dancing that night.
I was really upset. And he looked into my eyes and told me he would never, ever cheat on me. He wouldn't put me through anything like that.
I'm sorry.
It was really bizarre. I didn't believe what he had told me. It made me more suspicious.
But after the new year, her confidence was bolstered when the old Bruce seemed to be back.
Bruce had asked me to go out to dinner one night. He told me that he knew he hadn't been treating me right and things were going to get better now. Something had changed. He seemed to be a little more back in tune with his family and family life again.
So on June 15th, 2012, when Bruce made plans to visit his mother in Massachusetts for the day, Kathleen trusted him completely.
Bruce had told me that he might be home late. I didn't sleep very well at all because I kept thinking he was coming in.
But the next morning, when she woke up alone, Kathleen realized Bruce hadn't come home at all.
I tried calling him, but I went right into voicemail, and that was it. So it was very surprising because you couldn't pry the phone out of his hand for anything. I wasn't actually worried that something had happened to him. I was just angry at that point because Bruce had never done that before in the marriage.
Before Kathleen could gather her thoughts, the phone rang.
Bruce's brother called, which when I saw the caller ID was odd. His brother rarely called the house.
And he had some shocking news for Kathleen.
His brother said that Bruce had been arrested. I was just completely baffled.
When Bruce's brother revealed the alarming charges against her husband, Kathleen knew her world would never be the same.
He was like two totally different people.
He just lost control.
I was absolutely shocked. And I thought, oh my God, what could he possibly have done?
On June 16th, 2012, Kathleen Steinman was beside herself when her brother-in-law told her that her husband Bruce was sitting in an Arlington, Virginia jail cell.
I thought, oh my God, what could he possibly have done? Bruce's brother told me that one of the charges was stalking, and the other one was unlawful filming of a nude person. So I knew that it involved another woman. All I could keep thinking was that he was having an affair.
Kathleen barely had a moment to collect her thoughts before Bruce called on the other line.
The first thing he said was,
I'm in jail.
and I said, you fell in love with another woman? And he said, of course not. I was tricked and duped.
Of course not.
I said, what did you do to this woman? Why did you do this? And he just kept saying, she owed me money, she owed me money. And he said, I'm gonna need help. And then we got disconnected.
Kathleen was left with nothing but a dial tone and a million questions.
I was totally shocked. I had no idea what was happening.
Desperate to learn more about her husband's case, Kathleen went searching the internet and made a shocking connection.
I did see the woman's name connected to his name and recognized it.
The woman Bruce had been charged with stalking was Victoria, the stripper who had texted him.
And I clicked on her name, and that's when I found all these porn websites. I thought, oh my gosh, it wasn't just a woman that he knew or had been having an affair with, it was actually a prostitute. To actually see it and watch it, it was very traumatic.
I was shocked. Bruce would be the last person in the world I would ever expect to do what he had done. I think Kathleen was blindsided.
The following week, Kathleen accepted Bruce's call from jail, but it wasn't quite what she expected.
He wanted money for bail. He said if you had been a better wife, this wouldn't have happened. He actually said, if you have an ounce of humanity, you'll help me. So he was just saying all the wrong things to me.
Listen to me, Kathleen.
After 21 years of marriage, Kathleen was done.
He was not the guy I thought I married. Nothing seemed to matter anymore except what he needed. I was angry. Anything he did to me, he's also doing to his son.
Kathleen told Bruce she wasn't bailing him out. She had something else in mind.
I told him I wanted a divorce, and he didn't like that.
I don't care what I've done. I don't care how I treated you.
He was almost belligerent. So it just made me angry that he was so selfish and so narcissistic.
But even behind bars, Bruce was able to use his allowed phone calls to wreak havoc on Kathleen's life.
The day after that phone call, my cell phone was shut off, and I just thought the bill was due and Bruce in jail and he didn't pay it, so that's why the phone was shut off. But then I started getting bounced check notices. So I called the bank, and they said, oh, the money was transferred out.
Kathleen was shocked to discover that Bruce had removed almost all of their savings.
Bruce had called the bank. He left me $250. I was so angry and confused, but I thought he was in jail and I was safe.
Then on July 3rd, Kathleen's cable and Wi-Fi went out too.
I knew it was Bruce. He did that in one swift move. I was completely done with this man.
But the following month, Kathleen received an unexpected visit from the local police department.
They had come to the house because Bruce actually did make bail and was released from jail.
Kathleen had no idea how, but the officers confirmed that Bruce was back in town and told her a little detail about his stalking charges.
Bruce had sent his mistress a dead snake. That act in itself was a lethal act, so law enforcement was afraid that Bruce may come after Kathleen next.
They suggested that I go and get a protective order immediately. I was terrified at that point.
There was no telling where Bruce was, but Kathleen would discover everything her husband had done to his mistress and what he had in store for her.
This was personal. He did everything he could to hurt her.
Every night, I would barricade all the doors. I never thought he could be that vicious and vengeful.
In July of 2012, Kathleen Steinman was horrified when police informed her that her estranged husband Bruce had made bail and was back in the area while awaiting trial.
I was granted a temporary protective order, but I was terrified.
And it seemed not even a protective order could put an end to Bruce's vengeful behavior. 2 weeks later, Kathleen and her son came home to something strange.
Everything seemed fine. We were sort of settling in, and I went to get the laptop and my phone. And they were missing. I knew it was Bruce. It was scary knowing that Bruce had been in the house. I didn't know if he had been coming and going before. So I called the police.
Things were escalating, so law enforcement came and actually swept the house, sweeping it for monitoring devices.
Investigators found nothing, but Kathleen's growing involvement with police meant she was finally finding out exactly how her husband landed in jail, and it made her skin crawl. Detectives told Kathleen that Bruce met Victoria on one of his business flights.
At some point, the relationship went from a simple romance to a sexual relationship when she told him that the relationship was over. He did everything he could to hurt her.
He had in his mind to go after her however he could, and inflict pain and revenge that he couldn't do in person.
And he did so with a vengeance. It turned out Victoria was not a prostitute at all.
The detective told me that Bruce created all those websites, making it look like she was a prostitute.
Bruce Steinman secretly filmed her and him having sex, then used these images on porn sites that he created, advertising her for sex.
Bruce included her employer's phone number, her boss's phone number, her home address.
A whole slew of people were coming to this woman's door seeking sex. She was very frightened.
That September, while Bruce was still awaiting trial, he set his sights on Kathleen.
Bruce started terrorizing me using the laptop he stole from me. He kept changing the password so that I couldn't access my own emails. He would listen to my voicemails and then delete them. I didn't know what he might do.
So Kathleen was thrilled when on November 9th, 2012, she learned from the Arlington Police Department that Bruce was arrested outside of Victoria's apartment.
One of the conditions for his release was he was to stay away from this woman. But he didn't want this. He was stalking her again. The police were staking out the apartment, and they caught him red-handed. He had on him a knife, which he had been using to slash her tires.
When I found out he was arrested again, I was like, thank God. I don't have to worry about that anymore.
In December 2012, Bruce Steinman pled guilty to attempted extortion, 2 counts of stalking, and felony identity theft. He was sentenced to 7 years in jail.
It's very difficult for me to come to terms with the fact that someone I love would be capable of doing these things to anyone, let alone his own child and to me. There's no answer for it. There's no reason for it.
Today, Kathleen is thankful that the 2 years of terror are finally over. But she can't help wondering what changed in Bruce.
Bruce isn't the same guy that I was married to. I don't know what's happened to him. He just doesn't exist anymore. This whole experience has been totally traumatic and unbelievable.
I think Kathleen is going to be cautious. But I think definitely she's made leaps and bounds from where she was.
My son is doing great. Very well adjusted, very happy. You know, and my friends are great and saying, oh, you have to embrace your life. And I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to look forward to what the future might hold.
The concept of a safe haven is deeply ingrained in our collective understanding of family and home. We are conditioned to believe that the most secure place for a child is within the walls of their own house, specifically under the watchful, loving eyes of their mother. Society paints motherhood as an instinctive, natural journey filled with unconditional love and an unbreakable bond that transcends all earthly challenges. Yet, history has shown us that when the human mind fractures, even the most sacred of bonds can be distorted into something entirely unrecognizable. The tragedy we are about to explore is not a simple tale of malice or calculated evil. It is a profound, devastating collapse of mental health, a catastrophic failure of safety nets, and a horrific collision between severe psychiatric illness and rigid ideological beliefs. This is a story that forced an entire nation to look into the darkest corners of maternal mental illness, specifically the terrifying reality of postpartum psychosis and severe depression. It is a narrative that demands we set aside our initial, visceral reactions of pure horror to understand the complex, multi-layered failures that led to the unimaginable loss of 5 innocent lives. We must first center our thoughts on the victims, the 5 children whose lives were extinguished before they barely had a chance to begin. Noah, at 7 years old, was the eldest, a boy who should have been experiencing the simple joys of childhood, learning and growing. John, 5 years old, and Paul, just 3, were in the midst of their most formative years, full of curiosity and energy. Luke was only 2 years old, barely speaking, and finally, baby Mary, a fragile infant of just 6 months. These 5 siblings represented the entirety of a family's future, a future that was systematically dismantled on the morning of June 20th, 2001, in the quiet, seemingly ordinary suburban landscape of Pasadena, Texas. Their home, which should have been their ultimate sanctuary, transformed into the site of one of the most polarizing and heart-wrenching tragedies in modern American history. The loss of these children is a profound wound, a permanent scar on the community and the public consciousness, reminding us of the ultimate price paid when severe mental illness goes inadequately managed. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of this event, we must look at the agonizing history of the woman at the center of it all, Andrea Yates. She was not a stranger to the medical community, nor was her mental decline a sudden, unpredictable anomaly. Andrea was a former medical worker, someone who had previously dedicated her life to the care of others, yet she found herself trapped in a relentless, suffocating battle with her own mind. The darkness had been gathering for years. Following the birth of her 4th child, she was officially diagnosed with postpartum psychosis and severe depression. This was not the common, transient emotional fluctuation often referred to as baby blues. This was a severe, debilitating psychiatric condition characterized by a complete break from reality. By the year 1999, the weight of this illness had already pushed her to the absolute brink. She had made 2 separate attempts to end her own life, desperate actions that clearly signaled the overwhelming agony she was enduring. These attempts led to multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, desperate interventions meant to stabilize a mind that was actively turning against itself. The medical professionals who treated Andrea were acutely aware of the extreme danger she faced. They understood the cyclical and volatile nature of postpartum psychosis. Psychiatric experts issued stark, explicit warnings to both Andrea and her husband. They advised, in no uncertain terms, that having another child would almost certainly trigger future and potentially more dangerous psychotic episodes. The medical consensus was clear that the biological and psychological toll of another pregnancy could be the catalyst for a catastrophic break from reality. However, these urgent medical warnings were ultimately overridden by the couple's intense religious convictions. They were adherents of the Quiverful movement, a strict ideological belief system that dictates families should have as many children as physically possible, viewing each child as a direct blessing from a higher power and completely rejecting any form of birth control or family planning. Driven by this extreme religious doctrine, the medical advice was cast aside, and they made the fateful decision to conceive a 5th child. The arrival of baby Mary, while celebrated as a blessing under their religious framework, acted precisely as the psychiatrists had warned. It served as the trigger for a devastating resurgence of Andrea's severe psychosis and depression. Her mental state deteriorated rapidly, creating a highly volatile environment within the home. Because of her severe fragility and the unpredictable nature of her illness, her doctors implemented a strict safety protocol. The most crucial directive was that Andrea must never be left alone with her children. She required constant supervision, a safety net designed to protect both her and the 5 young lives entirely dependent upon her. This directive was the only barrier standing between the fragile reality she was struggling to maintain and the terrifying delusions that were consuming her mind. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, that vital safety net completely unraveled. The timeline of that morning is a chilling testament to how quickly disaster can strike when crucial preventative measures fail. Her husband, Rusty, left the house to go to work. The plan was for his mother to arrive shortly after to take over the supervision of Andrea and the children. This logistical transition created a devastatingly brief window of vulnerability. It was a gap of mere minutes, an estimated 1 hour of unsupervised time. In the grand scheme of a lifetime, an hour is nothing. But in the context of severe, untreated psychosis, 60 minutes is an eternity. It was within this solitary, unsupervised hour that the terrifying delusions completely overtook Andrea's fractured mind. Alone in the house with her 5 children, Andrea began to execute a methodical and deeply disturbing sequence of events. She filled the bathtub with water. One by one, in a state of severe psychotic delusion, she took the lives of her own children. From the oldest, Noah, down to the infant, Mary, she submerged them in the water until they were gone. The sheer contrast between the mundane domestic setting of a suburban bathroom and the unimaginable horror of the act itself is what makes this case so deeply unsettling. When the act was complete, the silence in the house must have been deafening. Immediately following this tragic sequence, Andrea did not attempt to flee or hide what had occurred. Instead, she picked up the telephone. She made a call to law enforcement and a separate call to her husband, instructing them both to come to the house. When authorities arrived at the scene, they were met with a nightmare that defied all comprehension. During the subsequent interrogations, the full depth of Andrea's psychosis was laid bare. She did not express a malicious hatred for her children. Instead, her explanation was rooted in a terrifying, delusional logic born of her illness and religious extremity. She confessed to the investigators that she genuinely believed she was possessed by evil forces. Her fractured mind had convinced her that her children were destined to burn in hell because of her own perceived failings as a mother. In her severely distorted reality, the only way to save their innocent souls from eternal damnation was to end their lives while they were still young and pure. This was not an act of vengeance, but rather, in the terrifying landscape of her psychosis, a twisted act of salvation. The legal proceedings that followed this tragedy were as complex and emotionally charged as the act itself. The judicial system was forced to grapple with the nearly impossible task of assigning criminal culpability to a woman whose mind was entirely unmoored from reality. The first trial took place in 2002 in the state of Texas. The proceedings hinged heavily on the legal definition of insanity, specifically the standard utilized in that jurisdiction. The prosecution argued fiercely that despite her severe mental illness, Andrea still possessed the cognitive ability to recognize that her actions were legally wrong at the exact moment she committed them. The jury, faced with the overwhelming horror of the crime, sided with the prosecution. Andrea was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, though she was spared the death penalty. This initial verdict reflected a societal struggle to reconcile the horrific nature of the crime with the invisible, yet all-consuming, nature of psychiatric disease. However, the pursuit of justice in this case was far from over. In 2005, a stunning revelation fundamentally altered the trajectory of the legal battle. The appellate court scrutinized the testimony provided during the 2002 trial, specifically focusing on the statements made by the prosecution's key psychiatric expert. It was uncovered that this expert had presented testimony to the jury regarding an episode of a popular television crime drama that featured a remarkably similar plotline. The expert suggested that Andrea might have modeled her actions after this television program. The devastating truth, however, was that this specific television episode never actually existed. The testimony was false. This egregious error fundamentally compromised the integrity of the original trial, leading the appellate court to overturn the 2002 conviction and mandate a new trial. The retrial in 2006 marked a monumental shift in how the justice system and the public viewed the intersection of maternal mental health and criminal responsibility. This time, the defense presented an overwhelmingly comprehensive portrait of a woman entirely consumed by psychosis. The jury was asked to look beyond the horrific outcome and examine the profound mental deterioration that caused it. After careful deliberation, the 2006 jury reached a vastly different conclusion than their predecessors. They delivered a verdict recognizing that at the precise moment of the tragedy, Andrea was suffering from delusions so severe and overwhelming that she was completely incapable of distinguishing moral right from moral wrong. She was found not responsible for her actions due to severe mental defect. This landmark verdict did not mean freedom for Andrea, but rather a transition from the punitive penal system to a secure psychiatric environment. She was committed to a specialized state facility in Texas, where she remains to this day. Reports indicate that she has consistently declined opportunities to be evaluated for potential release into the community, choosing instead to remain within the structured, therapeutic confines of the hospital, forever living with the immense weight of what occurred during that catastrophic lapse in her mental state. The ripple effects of this morning in Pasadena extended far beyond the walls of that suburban home and the courtroom. It served as a painful, necessary catalyst for widespread medical and social change. Prior to this event, conditions like postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis were heavily stigmatized, frequently minimized, or cruelly misunderstood as mere maternal selfishness or weakness. The loss of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary forced a global conversation about the biological realities of childbirth and the critical importance of maternal mental health screening. It shattered the illusion that a mother's love alone is always sufficient to combat severe psychiatric illness. As we step deeper into the meticulous details of this case, we must maintain an objective lens, carefully examining the ignored medical warnings, the rigid ideologies that blinded those involved to the impending danger, and the tragic sequence of events that unfolded within that fatal one-hour window. This is a journey into the darkest depths of the human mind, an exploration of systemic failure, and a somber reflection on the ultimate tragedy of 5 innocent lives lost to an invisible disease. To truly comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy that unfolded within the walls of the Yates home, we must first step back and look at the lives that were so abruptly extinguished and the suffocating atmosphere that preceded their loss. We have to humanize the statistics and give breath to the names that are forever etched in the annals of criminal history. At the very heart of this narrative are 5 young souls, each possessing their own distinct personality, their own developing quirks, and their own boundless potential. Noah, the eldest at 7 years old, was stepping into the role of the big brother. He was described as a bright, observant child, the one who first made Andrea and Rusty parents, altering the course of their lives forever. At 7, a child is just beginning to understand the world, taking in knowledge, asking endless questions, and looking up to his mother and father as the ultimate pillars of safety. Following him was 5-year-old John, a boy full of the boundless, kinetic energy that defines that specific age. 3-year-old Paul and 2-year-old Luke were essentially toddlers, navigating the world with clumsy steps and wide-eyed wonder, utterly dependent on the adults around them for every basic need. And finally, there was Mary. At just 6 months old, she was a fragile, helpless infant, an innocent life whose arrival into the world would unwittingly serve as the catalyst for the ultimate destruction of her entire family. These 5 children were not just a chaotic group of siblings. They were the center of a highly structured, insular world created by their parents. The Yates household was not your typical bustling suburban home. It was an environment heavily shaped by rigid ideological constraints. To understand how a mother could reach a point of such profound psychological fracture, we must thoroughly examine the immense, unrelenting pressure she was under. Andrea was not always the lost, hollow-eyed figure that the world would later see in courtroom sketches and mugshots. Before the darkness consumed her, she was a dedicated healthcare professional. She had worked as a registered nurse at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. By all accounts, she was compassionate, highly competent, and deeply invested in caring for others. She was a woman who enjoyed swimming, jogging, and living a vibrant, active life. But the trajectory of her existence shifted dramatically when she met and married Rusty Yates, and together, they embraced a deeply fundamentalist religious worldview. The couple became followers of an extreme ideology closely aligned with the Quiverful movement. This particular belief system dictates a strict, patriarchal family structure where the husband is the absolute authority and the wife is entirely submissive. More critically to this case, the movement preaches that every child is an absolute blessing from God, and families should welcome as many children as biologically possible. They view children as arrows in a warrior's quiver, meant to be raised strictly within the faith to eventually influence the world. Consequently, any form of birth control or family planning is strictly forbidden, viewed as a direct defiance of divine will. Adhering strictly to these tenets, Andrea and Rusty chose to live in a converted bus for a period, isolating themselves from mainstream society and focusing entirely on their growing family. Andrea took on the sole responsibility of homeschooling the children, managing the household, and fulfilling the relentless demands of a continuously expanding brood, all while submitting entirely to a theological framework that told her that her value was intrinsically tied to her ability to bear and raise children flawlessly. For a woman whose brain chemistry was already susceptible to severe depressive episodes, this lifestyle was not merely stressful. It was a psychological pressure cooker. The human body and mind can only endure so much trauma, exhaustion, and hormonal turbulence before something fundamentally breaks. The first significant fracture in Andrea's mental foundation occurred in the late summer of 1999, following the birth of her fourth child, Luke. It was here that the insidious monster of mental illness firmly took root in the Yates household. Andrea did not just experience the common, temporary melancholy often referred to as the baby blues. She plunged headfirst into the terrifying abyss of severe clinical depression and postpartum psychosis. This is a severe, debilitating psychiatric emergency characterized by a total detachment from reality. A mother suffering from this condition may experience vivid hallucinations, terrifying delusions, and severe cognitive impairment. She loses the ability to distinguish between her own internal nightmares and the external, waking world. In the summer of 1999, the severity of her condition manifested in a deeply alarming way. Overwhelmed by the crushing weight of her illness, Andrea made her first attempt to end her own life, taking an intentional overdose of pills. This desperate act was a glaring, undeniable siren warning that she was in acute psychological distress. She was hospitalized, treated with powerful antipsychotic medications, and briefly stabilized. But the demons were not banished. They were merely sedated. Just a short time later, the psychosis surged back with a vengeance. She was found in her bathroom, having held a knife to her own neck, pleading to be allowed to die. This second suicide attempt led to another, more intensive psychiatric hospitalization. During this period, the doctors treating her observed a woman who was catatonic, who refused to eat, who paced the hallways for hours, and who was actively experiencing severe psychotic delusions. She was entirely unmoored from reality. It was during these critical hospital stays that the medical professionals made a stark, unequivocal medical pronouncement. The psychiatrists who evaluated and treated Andrea sat down with both her and Rusty and delivered a dire warning. They explained the volatile and cyclical nature of postpartum psychosis. They made it absolutely clear that Andrea's mental breakdowns were intrinsically linked to the hormonal shifts and the extreme physical and psychological stress of childbirth and child-rearing. The medical advice was definitive. Andrea should not, under any circumstances, have any more children. The doctors warned that if she were to become pregnant again, the psychosis would almost certainly return, and when it did, it would likely be far more severe, deeply entrenched, and potentially catastrophic. They explicitly outlined the dangers, creating a clear, documented medical boundary meant to protect Andrea's life and the lives of the children she already had. This is the juncture in the narrative where the tragedy transforms from a medical misfortune into a systemic and ideological catastrophe. Despite the stark warnings from experienced psychiatric professionals, despite having witnessed his wife reduced to a catatonic state and attempting to end her own life twice, the religious convictions held by the couple remained rigid and unyielding. The doctrine of the quiverful movement, the belief that they must leave their family planning entirely in the hands of a higher power, completely overshadowed the urgent medical reality staring them in the face. Driven by this extreme faith, they actively disregarded the psychiatric advice. They chose to believe that their faith would shield them from the biological reality of severe mental illness. It was a fatal gamble, one rooted in a tragic misunderstanding of how deeply and permanently psychosis can warp the human brain. Approximately 7 months after her second discharge from the psychiatric facility, Andrea conceived her 5th child. As the medical professionals had grimly predicted, the pregnancy and the subsequent birth of baby Mary served as the ultimate trigger. The fragile mental equilibrium Andrea had managed to establish completely shattered. Following Mary's birth, Andrea's decline was rapid, profound, and utterly devastating. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, and stopped functioning. She was drowning in a sea of dark, terrifying delusions. Her religious beliefs, once a source of structure, mutated under the influence of psychosis into a source of immense, inescapable terror. She began to believe that she was fundamentally evil, that she was failing her children in the eyes of God, and that because of her inadequacies, her beautiful, innocent children were destined to burn in the fires of hell for all eternity. Recognizing the extreme peril of her deteriorating state, her treating psychiatrist implemented a strict, non-negotiable safety protocol. The directive was simple but vital. Andrea was not to be left alone with the children for any reason, at any time. She required constant, unbroken supervision. Her mental state was too volatile, her delusions too deeply entrenched, to trust her alone with 5 vulnerable lives. This medical mandate was the final, desperate safety net designed to prevent a tragedy. The family attempted to manage this heavy burden, setting up a schedule where Rusty would care for them when he was home, and his mother would come over during the day when he was at work. It was a fragile system, reliant on perfect timing and unbroken vigilance. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, that fragile system failed. The sequence of events on that morning highlights the terrifying swiftness with which extreme psychosis can exploit a momentary lapse in supervision. Rusty Yates, adhering to his normal routine, prepared to leave for his job at NASA. The established plan was for his mother to arrive shortly after his departure to seamlessly take over the watch. Rusty walked out the door, believing that the gap in supervision would be incredibly brief, perhaps just an hour, before his mother arrived. He assumed that a single hour was a manageable risk, but in the landscape of severe, untreated postpartum psychosis, an hour is not just 60 minutes. It is a vast, expansive window of opportunity for the demons of the mind to take complete control. The moment the door closed behind her husband, Andrea was entirely alone with Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary. The safety net had vanished. In that quiet, unsupervised hour, the horrific delusions that had been tormenting her for months reached their absolute peak. The warped logic of her illness convinced her that the only way to save her children from eternal damnation was to take their lives while they were still pure and untainted by the world. It was a dark, twisted sense of maternal duty, birthed entirely from a mind that had completely lost its tether to reality. The tragedy that followed was not born of malice or sudden rage. It was the tragic, devastating culmination of ignored medical warnings, extreme ideological pressure, and a catastrophic failure to protect a woman whose mind was actively destroying itself. The morning of June 20th in the year 2001 began with the deceptive tranquility that characterizes countless suburban neighborhoods across the country, masking the profound psychiatric catastrophe that was about to unfold within the walls of the Yates residence in Pasadena, Texas. The dawn brought with it the routine rustlings of a family of 7 preparing for the day, an ordinary choreography of breakfast and morning chores that provided a fragile veneer of normalcy over an incredibly dangerous situation. Rusty Yates, adhering to the demands of his professional life, readied himself for his departure to work, operating under a critical but ultimately flawed logistical plan designed to manage his wife's severe mental illness. The medical mandate was absolute in its clarity, explicitly dictating that Andrea must never be left unsupervised with the children due to the extreme volatility of her postpartum psychosis. To comply with this vital safety protocol, a transition of care had been arranged, a daily handoff where Rusty's mother would arrive to assume the supervisory role the moment he departed for his office. However, the schedule on this particular morning contained a fatal flaw, a seemingly brief intermission in the constant vigilance required to keep the family safe. When Rusty walked out the front door and began his commute, his mother had not yet arrived, creating an unsupervised window of time that was estimated to be merely one single hour. In the ordinary course of a human life, an hour is a fleeting, inconsequential measurement of time, easily lost to mundane tasks or idle distractions. Yet, in the terrifying, distorted landscape of severe, untreated psychiatric illness, a 60-minute span of isolation is not merely an intermission. It is an eternity, a vast and expansive void into which the fragile remnants of reality can entirely collapse. The closing of the front door was not just a physical separation. It was the removal of the final, desperate barrier standing between a deeply psychotic mother and the 5 young lives that were entirely dependent upon her for their protection and care. As the sound of the departing vehicle faded into the ambient noise of the neighborhood, a profound and heavy silence descended upon the house, leaving Andrea entirely alone with her 7-year-old son Noah, her 5-year-old son John, her 3-year-old son Paul, her 2-year-old son Luke, and her fragile 6-month-old infant daughter Mary. The absence of another adult in the home acted as an immediate catalyst for the horrific delusions that had been festering within her fractured mind, unleashed by the lack of any external grounding force. The severe postpartum psychosis, compounded by years of clinical depression and the immense pressure of her rigid lifestyle, surged forward with devastating power, completely obliterating any remaining tether to rational thought or maternal instinct. According to the subsequent interrogations and psychiatric evaluations, Andrea was not acting out of a place of sudden rage, malicious intent, or a desire for vengeance against her husband or her circumstances. Instead, she was engulfed by a profound, all-consuming religious delusion that completely inverted her understanding of right, wrong, love, and protection. Her mind, ravaged by the chemical imbalances of her illness, had become utterly convinced that she was physically and spiritually possessed by demonic forces, believing that the devil himself had taken up residence within her soul. This terrifying hallucination was not a fleeting thought, but a concrete, absolute reality in her mind, a truth as tangible as the floor beneath her feet. Driven by this horrifying conviction, she looked at her 5 children not with anger, but with a deeply distorted sense of ultimate despair and twisted responsibility. Within the framework of her psychotic break, Andrea reached a conclusion that defies all logical comprehension but made perfect, devastating sense within the closed loop of her severe mental illness. She believed that because of her demonic possession and her perceived total failure as a mother, her children were inherently doomed, destined to follow her into darkness and eventually suffer the unimaginable agony of burning in hell for all eternity. The psychosis had convinced her that the children were in immediate, spiritual peril, and that the only possible way to save their innocent souls from eternal damnation was to intercept their lives before they could reach an age of moral accountability. In her mind, the act of ending their lives was not murder, but the ultimate, necessary sacrifice, a horrific act of salvation designed to guarantee their entry into heaven while they were still pure and uncorrupted by the evil she believed she carried. This is the most chilling and complex aspect of the tragedy, illustrating how severe psychiatric illness can entirely hijack the human brain, weaponizing a mother's instinct to protect her children and transforming it into the exact mechanism of their destruction. The delusions had created a scenario where earthly death was perceived as the only viable escape route from spiritual annihilation. Operating under this absolute, unwavering delusion, Andrea began to execute a methodical and tragically deliberate sequence of events. She moved through the house with the cold, detached efficiency of someone performing a grim but necessary duty, her actions stripped of any visible emotion or hesitation because her reality had been entirely rewritten by her illness. She walked into the bathroom, the most mundane and utilitarian of domestic spaces, and initiated the catastrophic plan by turning the faucet and allowing the bathtub to fill completely with water. The sound of the rushing water echoing against the tile walls must have stood in stark contrast to the quiet innocence of the children playing in the adjacent rooms, entirely oblivious to the deadly transformation occurring within their mother's mind. The bathtub, normally a place of comfort, hygiene, and playful routine for the 5 siblings was systematically repurposed into an instrument of unimaginable tragedy. The physical preparation was simple, requiring no specialized tools or complex planning, highlighting the terrifying vulnerability of children when the primary source of their safety becomes the very source of their peril. As the water reached the brim, the stage was set for the systematic dismantling of the Yates family. What followed was a horrific, sequential process that claims the lives of 5 innocent children, an act so profoundly devastating that it remains incredibly difficult to conceptualize. Andrea, fully submerged in her psychotic belief system, took the lives of her children one by one, utilizing the filled bathtub to drown them in a chillingly methodical manner. She ended the life of her oldest son, Noah, a 7-year-old boy who was just beginning to understand the complexities of the world around him, a child who had brought the very concept of parenthood into her life. She took the life of 5-year-old John, extinguishing a bright, energetic presence before he could even reach his 6th birthday. She drowned 3-year-old Paul and 2-year-old Luke, toddlers who were entirely dependent on her for every aspect of their survival, completely incapable of understanding or defending themselves against the horrific reality unfolding in their home. And with unimaginable tragedy, she ended the life of Mary, her 6-month-old daughter, the fragile infant whose birth had been the biological trigger for the massive resurgence of the psychiatric illness that was now directing her mother's actions. The act of drowning 5 individuals, especially one's own children, requires a sustained, physical exertion and a complete, absolute dissociation from the horrific reality of the act itself. The fact that she was able to complete this unimaginable task on all 5 children speaks to the overwhelming, impenetrable nature of the psychosis that had taken control of her brain, blinding her to the desperate struggles and the profound loss of life occurring at her own hands. When the devastating sequence was finally complete, the house fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, the vibrant, chaotic energy of 5 young children permanently extinguished. Andrea remained in the home, completely soaked from the horrific task she had just completed, surrounded by the devastating consequences of her delusions. Yet, even in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, her actions continued to be entirely dictated by the warped logic of her psychiatric condition. She did not attempt to flee the scene, she did not try to clean up the evidence, and she made no effort to conceal the unimaginable act she had just committed. To her fractured mind, she had successfully completed a necessary, albeit terrible, spiritual mission. She had saved their souls, and there was nothing left to hide. Moving with the same detached, mechanical demeanor, she approached the telephone to alert the outside world to what had occurred within the quiet suburban home. Her first call was directed to law enforcement, reaching out to the emergency dispatchers to report the situation. She did not provide frantic explanations or hysterical confessions. Instead, she delivered a flat, emotionless request, simply informing the dispatcher that she required the immediate presence of a police officer at her residence. When pressed for details regarding the nature of the emergency, she refused to elaborate, maintaining a chillingly calm demeanor that deeply unsettled the operator on the other end of the line. Following the call to the police, she dialed the number for her husband's workplace, reaching Rusty at his office at NASA. She instructed him in a similarly detached manner, informing him that it was imperative he return to the house immediately. She offered no comforting words, no apologies, and no explanation for the urgent summons, leaving him in a state of deep confusion and rising panic as he abruptly left his job to rush back to the home he had departed less than an hour prior. These phone calls are a crucial element in understanding her mental state, demonstrating a complete lack of consciousness of guilt in the traditional legal sense. She was turning herself in not because she felt she had committed a malicious crime, but because her horrific task was complete, and she was simply initiating the next logical step in the aftermath of her twisted act of salvation. The arrival of the first responding police officers marked the devastating collision between Andrea's psychotic, internal reality and the objective, horrific truth of the external world. When law enforcement approached the residence, expecting to address a routine domestic issue or a medical emergency, they were completely unprepared for the sheer scale of the tragedy that awaited them behind the front door. Andrea greeted the officers, her physical appearance bearing the unmistakable evidence of the recent events, her clothes clinging to her wet body, her demeanor eerily placid and cooperative. As the officers stepped over the threshold and began their initial sweep of the residence, the profound, agonizing reality of the morning's events was slowly and painfully revealed to them. They moved through the quiet hallways, eventually discovering the heartbreaking scene, the physical proof that 5 young, innocent lives had been systematically erased within the span of a single, unsupervised hour. The discovery sent shockwaves through the responding personnel, transforming the quiet, unsuspecting suburban property into the focal point of one of the most intense, emotionally devastating, and legally complex crime scenes in modern history. The tragedy of the Yates children was no longer a private, isolated event. It had crossed into the public domain, initiating a long, painful process of investigation, psychiatric evaluation, and legal battles that would force a nation to confront the terrifying, destructive capabilities of severe maternal mental illness. The transition from the immediate horror of the suburban crime scene to the sterile, highly structured environment of the police interrogation room marked the beginning of an investigation that would fundamentally challenge the criminal justice system. When law enforcement officers escorted Andrea Yates away from her home, she was not resisting, nor was she exhibiting the frantic, chaotic behavior one might typically associate with a mind that had just orchestrated such an immense tragedy. Instead, she was described by the transporting officers and the seasoned detectives who received her as being in a state of profound emotional flattening, an almost catatonic detachment that stood in terrifying contrast to the magnitude of the lives that had just been extinguished. She was still wearing the damp clothing from the horrific events of the morning, a visceral, physical reminder of the reality she had left behind in the bathrooms of her residence. As she was seated in the stark, windowless interview room, the investigating detectives, individuals who had spent their careers analyzing human malice and calculated violence, found themselves navigating entirely uncharted psychological territory. They were accustomed to suspects who would deny their involvement, suspects who would attempt to shift the blame, or suspects who would break down in a dramatic display of remorse or manufactured grief. Andrea did none of these things. She sat before them with an eerie, impenetrable stillness, completely devoid of the traditional markers of criminal consciousness. The investigators initiated their questioning with the standard protocols designed to establish a timeline and ascertain a motive, carefully probing for any underlying marital discord, financial desperation, or hidden resentments that might explain the incomprehensible. However, every standard investigative avenue they pursued immediately collided with a massive, unyielding wall of severe psychiatric delusion. She answered their inquiries with a chillingly calm and measured cadence, completely eschewing any attempt to conceal her actions or protect herself from the inevitable legal consequences. Through her responses, the detectives were forced to peer into the terrifying abyss of her untreated postpartum psychosis, a dark and distorted reality where the most fundamental maternal instincts had been entirely inverted. She calmly informed the authorities that she was entirely responsible for the deaths of her 5 children, providing a systematic and detached recounting of the morning's events that lacked any emotional inflection. When the investigators pushed for the underlying reasoning behind her actions, desperately searching for a recognizable human motive, they were met with an explanation rooted entirely in a horrific religious hallucination. She explained to the stunned detectives that she was fundamentally evil, asserting that her soul was possessed by demonic entities that had irrevocably corrupted her. In her severely fractured perception of reality, this demonic possession meant that she was fundamentally failing her children, not just in a worldly sense, but in an eternal, spiritual dimension. She firmly believed that because she was raising them while tainted by this profound evil, her innocent children were destined to follow her path into darkness, ultimately facing eternal damnation and unimaginable suffering in hell. The investigation revealed that her actions were not driven by a sudden explosion of anger or a desire to unburden herself from the exhausting demands of motherhood. Instead, her horrifying actions were the direct result of a twisted, psychotic logic that convinced her the only possible method to secure her children's salvation and ensure their entry into heaven was to end their lives before they reached an age where they could be held morally accountable by a higher power. The detectives found themselves documenting a confession that was simultaneously a complete admission of guilt and a profound demonstration of severe mental defect, complicating the trajectory of the case from its very inception. The focus of the investigation rapidly shifted from establishing the basic facts of the crime, which were never truly in dispute, to the monumental task of determining her state of mind at the exact moment the tragedy occurred. This transition moved the case from the realm of physical evidence and forensic analysis into the deeply subjective and highly contested arena of forensic psychiatry and legal philosophy. In the state of Texas, the legal framework surrounding the insanity defense is notoriously rigid and incredibly difficult for a defendant to successfully navigate. The jurisdiction strictly adheres to a variation of the Manhattan Rule, a 19th-century legal standard that places an exceptionally high burden of proof on the defense. Under this stringent legal doctrine, it is not simply enough to prove that the defendant was suffering from a severe, documented mental illness at the time of the offense. The defense must definitively demonstrate that the mental disease or defect was so absolute and overwhelming that it completely obliterated the defendant's cognitive ability to comprehend that their actions were legally or morally wrong. This meant that the investigating teams, both for the prosecution and the defense, had to dissect every single action, every single statement, and every single moment leading up to the tragedy to determine if Andrea possessed even a fleeting glimmer of rational understanding regarding the wrongfulness of her conduct. The prosecution, representing the state, acknowledged her history of mental health struggles, but built a formidable case arguing that her actions on that fateful morning demonstrated a clear, calculated level of premeditation that betrayed a consciousness of guilt. The prosecuting attorneys directed the investigators to focus heavily on the specific timeline of events, particularly the crucial fact that she had waited until her husband had left for work and before her mother-in-law arrived to initiate the sequence of events. They argued that this careful selection of an unsupervised window of time indicated a strategic, rational mind that understood the illicit nature of the act and actively sought to avoid detection or intervention until the task was complete. Furthermore, they emphasized her immediate actions following the tragedy, pointing to the fact that she had autonomously called the emergency services and requested police presence, arguing that this demonstrated a clear recognition that she had committed a crime and needed to surrender to the authorities. The investigation became a highly polarizing battle of psychiatric interpretation, with the prosecution striving to frame her severe illness as a contributing factor rather than a completely exculpatory condition, maintaining that despite her terrifying delusions, a portion of her mind remained tethered to the earthly reality of law and consequence. To bolster their narrative of calculated premeditation and to counter the overwhelming evidence of her severe postpartum psychosis, the prosecution enlisted the expertise of a highly renowned forensic psychiatrist, a move that would ultimately introduce the most significant and controversial twist into the entirety of the investigation and the subsequent legal proceedings. This expert witness was brought into the investigation to provide a definitive, authoritative assessment of her mental state, tasked with dissecting her psychiatric history and interpreting her behavior through the strict lens of the Texas Insanity Standard. The expert conducted extensive interviews and reviewed the voluminous medical records, eventually formulating a theory that became the absolute cornerstone of the prosecution's argument against the insanity plea. During his consultation and eventual presentation of his findings, the expert introduced a deeply compelling but ultimately catastrophic element into the narrative, providing the jury with a highly relatable, tangible explanation for her seemingly inexplicable actions. He posited that while she was undeniably struggling with severe mental health issues, her specific actions on the morning of the tragedy were not entirely the product of an organic, chaotic psychotic break, but rather a tragic imitation of a scenario she had absorbed from popular culture. The expert confidently informed the investigative team and eventually the court that he consulted on a highly popular television crime drama series, Law and Order, and he specifically recalled a recent episode that bore a chilling, almost identical resemblance to the horrifying events that had transpired in the Yates household. According to this expert testimony, the television episode featured a storyline about a mother grappling with severe postpartum depression who ultimately drowns her young children in a bathtub and subsequently attempts to utilize the insanity defense to evade criminal responsibility. The prosecution seized upon this explosive piece of information, integrating it deeply into their investigative narrative. They utilized this supposed television episode to construct a powerful argument that Andrea had not acted in a state of blind, uncontrolled delusion, but had instead consumed this specific media, internalized the plotline, and deliberately modeled her actions after the fictional narrative, fully aware of the legal strategies she would employ in the aftermath. This testimony provided the investigative narrative with the exact mechanism needed to bridge the gap between her documented mental illness and the legal requirement for premeditation and cognitive awareness of wrongdoing. It offered a neat, digestible explanation for the jury, suggesting that her horrific actions were fundamentally grounded in a calculated, earthly plan rather than a complete detachment from reality. This single piece of expert testimony became the most devastating weapon in the prosecution's arsenal, effectively neutralizing the defense's extensive documentation of her profound psychiatric collapse and ultimately securing a conviction in the initial phase of the legal process. However, the integrity of this entire investigative narrative and the subsequent conviction hinged entirely on the factual accuracy of this specific piece of expert testimony, an accuracy that would soon be subjected to intense, unprecedented scrutiny during the appellate process. Years after the initial investigation had concluded and the heavy doors of the state prison had closed behind her, a dedicated team of appellate attorneys began the arduous task of deconstructing the immense volume of trial transcripts and investigative reports, meticulously searching for any procedural errors or constitutional violations that might warrant a review of the life sentence. During this painstaking review, the appellate investigators turned their focused attention to the prosecution's star psychiatric witness and the devastating testimony regarding the television crime drama. Driven by a necessity to verify every single piece of evidence that had contributed to the conviction, the defense team initiated a comprehensive search to locate and review the specific episode that the expert had so confidently described under oath. They contacted the television network, scoured the production archives, and meticulously reviewed the synopses of every single episode that had aired in the years leading up to the tragedy, searching for the storyline about the mother drowning her children and utilizing the insanity defense. The results of this exhaustive investigation yielded a discovery that fundamentally shattered the foundation of the prosecution's case and exposed a catastrophic failure within the forensic psychiatric evaluation process. The appellate investigators discovered, with absolute certainty, that the television episode described by the expert witness simply did not exist. There had never been a storyline matching that specific, highly prejudicial description broadcast on that particular program prior to the tragic events in Pasadena. The devastating realization that the jury had been presented with materially false information regarding a crucial element of the prosecution's theory of premeditation sent shockwaves through the legal community. This monumental revelation completely dismantled the narrative that she had calculatedly modeled her actions after a fictional blueprint, forcing the justice system to confront the terrifying reality that her actions were, in fact, entirely generated by the dark, unstructured chaos of her own severely diseased mind. The discovery of this false testimony was not merely a minor procedural technicality. It was a profound, systemic error that had fundamentally altered the jury's perception of her culpability, ultimately leading the appellate courts to a massive, unprecedented intervention. The investigation into the false testimony proved that the most damaging piece of evidence used to establish her sanity was entirely fabricated by human error, a realization that forced the courts to overturn the initial conviction and paved the way for a dramatic reevaluation of the entire tragedy, forever changing the trajectory of a case that had already deeply scarred the national consciousness. The overturning of the initial conviction in 2005 marked a profound and unprecedented turning point in the legal battle surrounding Andrea Yates, effectively resetting a judicial process that had previously grappled with the terrifying intersection of severe mental illness and criminal accountability. The appellate court's decision to invalidate the 2002 life sentence was not merely a procedural correction. It was a stark acknowledgement that the integrity of the original trial had been fundamentally compromised by materially false expert testimony. The revelation that the prosecution's primary psychiatric witness had presented fabricated information regarding a non-existent television plotline stripped away the cornerstone of the state's argument for calculated premeditation. For the legal teams, the appellate ruling meant that the slate was wiped clean, forcing both the prosecution and the defense to prepare for a completely new trial that would take place in 2006. This second legal proceeding offered a rare second chance for the judicial system to properly evaluate the tragedy, unmarred by the sensationalized and erroneous claims that had previously skewed the jury's perception. The stakes were extraordinarily high, as the retrial would once again thrust a deeply polarized public and a weary legal establishment back into the agonizing debate over how the law should judge a mother whose mind had been completely shattered by postpartum psychosis. As the legal teams prepared for the 2006 retrial, the defense focused its strategy on presenting an overwhelmingly rigorous and scientifically grounded portrait of Andrea's psychiatric collapse. Unlike the first trial, where the narrative was occasionally overshadowed by emotional reactions to the horrific nature of the crime and the false television narrative, the defense attorneys meticulously assembled a vast array of undeniable medical evidence. They gathered years of clinical records, hospitalizations, and diagnostic evaluations from the multiple medical professionals who had treated her severe depressive episodes and psychotic breaks following the births of her children. Independent forensic psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate her mental state during the critical window leading up to and including the morning of June 20th, 2001. These experts did not rely on speculative theories or cultural tropes. Instead, they analyzed the organic, biological realities of severe postpartum psychosis, explaining to the court how the condition completely erodes a person's cognitive and moral faculties. The defense team aimed to demonstrate that Andrea's actions were not the product of a rational, criminal mind attempting to evade detection, but rather the tragic, inevitable symptom of a brain entirely controlled by unyielding, terrifying delusions. They meticulously walked the court through her history of suicide attempts, the explicit warnings issued by her doctors regarding subsequent pregnancies, and the rapid deterioration of her cognitive functions following the birth of her fifth child, baby Mary. The core legal battleground of the 2006 retrial once again centered on the exceptionally rigid insanity standard utilized within the jurisdiction of Texas, a standard that adheres strictly to the historic Manhattan Rule. Under this stringent legal framework, proving insanity requires meeting a remarkably high burden of proof, demanding that the defense establish not only that the defendant was suffering from a severe mental disease at the time of the offense, but that the illness completely destroyed their ability to comprehend the nature and quality of their actions, or to distinguish between moral right and wrong. The prosecution, fully aware of this formidable legal hurdle, sought to maintain its original position that despite her severe mental illness, Andrea retained a sufficient degree of cognitive awareness to understand the wrongfulness of her conduct. The state's attorneys pointed once again to her systematic approach during the morning of the tragedy and her subsequent phone calls to emergency services as evidence of a functioning intellect that recognized the legal implications of what she had done. However, this time, the prosecution had to construct their argument without the devastating prop of the fabricated television plotline, forcing them to rely strictly on the remaining factual evidence of her behavior. In response, the defense presented a sophisticated and deeply empathetic explanation of the Manhattan Rule as it applied specifically to profound religious delusions. They argued that within the dark, enclosed world of Andrea's psychosis, her belief that she was saving her children from eternal damnation was so absolute that, in her severely distorted moral framework, she genuinely believed she was performing an act of ultimate, necessary love. The defense articulated the profound distinction between legal wrongfulness and moral wrongfulness under extreme psychosis, explaining that when a mind is convinced it is executing a divine mandate to prevent eternal spiritual agony, the traditional capacity to perceive moral right is entirely obliterated. The courtroom atmosphere during the 2006 retrial was heavy with tension, reflecting a society and a legal system that had spent 5 years grappling with the complex implications of the case. The jury, tasked with the immense responsibility of weighing the evidence and rendering a verdict, listened intently to weeks of exhaustive testimony, detailed medical histories, and profound psychiatric analyses. Unlike the proceedings of 4 years prior, this jury was presented with an unvarnished, medically accurate picture of postpartum psychosis, stripped of the distortions that had previously clouded the judicial process. They were asked to look past the visceral horror of the outcome and confront the invisible, all-consuming reality of severe psychiatric disease. After careful, deliberate, and emotionally taxing deliberations, the 2006 jury reached a monumental conclusion that fundamentally contrasted with the initial verdict. They delivered a historic and legally significant verdict, determining that Andrea Yates was not guilty of capital murder by reason of insanity. The courtroom reacted with a mixture of solemn relief and profound quiet, as the judicial system formally recognized that at the precise moment of the tragedy, Andrea was suffering from a mental defect so severe and total that she was entirely incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong. The delivery of the not guilty by reason of insanity verdict did not mean that Andrea walked out of the courtroom a free woman, nor did it signify a dismissal of the immense tragedy that had occurred within the suburban home. Under the legal framework governing insanity acquittals in Texas, the verdict mandated an immediate, involuntary commitment to a maximum security state psychiatric facility, ensuring that she would remain under strict institutional care for the remainder of her life unless she could be definitively proven to no longer pose a danger to herself or others. Andrea was transferred to the Kerrville State Hospital, a specialized facility equipped to handle individuals with severe, chronic psychiatric conditions requiring long-term intervention and secure monitoring. Within the walls of the hospital, far removed from the glaring lights of the media and the intense scrutiny of the public eye, she began the slow, quiet existence of a patient undergoing indefinite psychiatric treatment. Over the subsequent years, reports from medical professionals and legal representatives indicated that she remained deeply withdrawn, carrying the immense, crushing weight of the realization of what had occurred during her psychotic break. Demonstrating the profound depth of her internal remorse and the ongoing impact of her illness, Andrea consistently chose to decline opportunities to participate in hearings or evaluations that could potentially grant her conditional release or transition her into a less restrictive community setting. She elected instead to remain within the structured, therapeutic confines of the state facility, quietly accepting the institution as her permanent home. The conclusion of the legal proceedings and her subsequent institutionalization did not erase the profound impact of the tragedy, but it firmly established a new paradigm in how the intersection of severe mental health and criminal law is understood. The journey from the initial conviction to the historic 2006 acquittal served as a permanent reminder of the critical importance of absolute integrity within forensic science and the catastrophic consequences of ignoring severe medical warnings. The case of Andrea Yates transformed from a shocking local event into a foundational milestone in psychiatric jurisprudence, forever altering the legal landscape surrounding postpartum mental illness and ensuring that future courts would approach the dark complexities of psychosis with a much deeper, more scientifically grounded level of understanding. The legal conclusion of the Andrea Yates case and her subsequent institutionalization did not mark the end of the narrative, but rather signaled the beginning of a profound, agonizing reckoning for society, the medical community, and the American legal system. When the courtroom doors finally closed on the legal proceedings, the echoes of what had occurred inside that Pasadena home continued to reverberate across the globe, transforming a local tragedy into an enduring symbol of systemic failure and psychiatric vulnerability. For years, the public conversation surrounding the events of June 20th, 2001, was dominated by visceral horror, instinctive condemnation, and a desperate desire to find a simple, easily digestible explanation for something that defied all conventional understanding of human nature. People struggled to reconcile the sacred, culturally idealized image of motherhood with the horrifying reality of a mother who had taken the lives of her own children. Yet, as the sensationalism of the initial trials faded and the stark medical facts of severe postpartum psychosis became clear, a much more uncomfortable and necessary dialogue began to emerge. The case forced a collective awakening, compelling society to confront the invisible, terrifying mechanisms of severe psychiatric illness and the devastating consequences of ignoring the fragile boundaries of the human mind when it is stripped of its safety nets. Prior to this historic case, conditions such as postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis were shrouded in profound stigma, frequently minimized, misunderstood, or cruelly mischaracterized as mere weakness, emotional instability, or personal selfishness on the part of the mother. Society operated under the dangerous assumption that the arrival of a child would naturally awaken an unbreakable, all-powerful maternal instinct capable of shielding a woman against any internal psychological darkness. When mothers experienced overwhelming sadness, anxiety, or intrusive thoughts following childbirth, they were often told to simply push through the discomfort, dismissed as suffering from a temporary bout of the baby blues that would eventually resolve on its own. The tragedy of the Yates family shattered these dangerous misconceptions with a brutal, undeniable finality. It laid bare the terrifying biological reality that postpartum psychosis is not a choice, a character flaw, or a failure of will, but a legitimate, acute psychiatric emergency characterized by a complete detachment from reality. The public began to understand that when the chemical balance of the brain is violently disrupted by the massive hormonal shifts following childbirth, the human mind can become entirely unrecognizable to the person experiencing it. This case forced a critical shift in how medical professionals and the general public viewed maternal mental health, stripping away the archaic moral judgments that had long prevented struggling mothers from seeking and receiving the urgent, specialized care they desperately needed. The ripple effects of the case extended deep into the structures of modern healthcare, leading to significant, long-overdue reforms in how obstetricians, pediatricians, and general practitioners approach the care of new mothers. Medical institutions across the country began to implement mandatory, routine screenings for postpartum depression and psychiatric distress during prenatal and postnatal checkups, ensuring that women were no longer left to navigate the vulnerable postpartum period in isolation. Healthcare providers were trained to look beyond the superficial responses of new mothers, recognizing that individuals suffering from severe psychiatric distress often mask their symptoms out of fear, shame, or the paralyzing confusion of their illness. The medical community established clearer protocols for intervention, emphasizing that family history of mental illness and previous psychiatric crises must be treated as critical risk factors requiring continuous, unbroken monitoring rather than quiet optimism. Furthermore, the case highlighted the vital importance of involving family members in the psychiatric safety net, educating spouses and relatives about the warning signs of escalating psychosis so they could actively participate in safeguarding both the mother and the children. These institutional changes, forged in the wake of an unimaginable tragedy, ensured that countless families over the subsequent decades would receive the proactive interventions and medical support that Andrea Yates so tragically lacked during her desperate descent into psychosis. Yet amidst the broad societal shifts and the complex legal precedents, it is essential that we never lose sight of the true human cost at the center of this tragedy, anchoring our reflections back to the 5 innocent lives that were extinguished in a single fatal hour. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary were not merely statistical data points in a landmark psychiatric case, nor were they abstract symbols of a broken healthcare system. They were vibrant, developing children with boundless potential, infectious laughter, and unique personalities that enriched the world before their lives were cut senselessly short. Noah, the protective older brother stepping into his 7th year. John, full of the bright, kinetic energy of a 5-year-old. Paul and Luke, navigating their toddler years with clumsy, beautiful curiosity. And baby Mary, a fragile infant of 6 months whose existence was tragically intertwined with the psychological storm consuming her mother. The void left by their absence is permanent and absolute, a profound, aching wound in the fabric of their family and the wider community that no amount of legal reform, medical advancement, or societal awareness can ever truly heal. Their memories remain as a solemn, heartbreaking reminder of the ultimate price paid when severe mental illness goes unrecognized, unsupported, and untreated, demanding that we honor their brief lives by remaining eternally vigilant in our protection of the vulnerable. Today, far away from the glaring lights of the media and the intense scrutiny of the public eye, Andrea Yates resides quietly within the secure confines of the Kerrville State Hospital in Texas, living out her days as a permanent resident of a specialized psychiatric facility. Unlike ordinary prisoners serving punitive sentences in the penal system, her existence is defined by institutional treatment, medical supervision, and the heavy, inescapable shadow of her actions. Reports from medical professionals, legal advocates, and family members who have maintained contact indicate that she remains deeply withdrawn, living with the profound, agonizing realization of what occurred during her psychotic break once the fog of her illness partially lifted and allowed her to comprehend the magnitude of the loss. Demonstrating the absolute depth of her remorse and the ongoing, irreversible impact of her condition, Andrea has consistently chosen to decline opportunities to participate in hearings or evaluations that could potentially grant her conditional release or transition her into a less restrictive community setting. She has repeatedly elected to remain within the structured, therapeutic walls of the hospital, quietly accepting the institution as her permanent home and refusing to seek freedom for a life she feels she can no longer participate in. Her quiet, isolated existence within the facility stands as a poignant, haunting testament to the tragic reality that there are some psychiatric storms so devastating, so complete in their destruction, that no recovery can ever truly restore what was lost. As we step back from the meticulous details of this dark narrative, the case of Andrea Yates remains one of the most haunting, complex, and emotionally demanding chapters in modern true crime history. It challenges our fundamental understanding of guilt and innocence, forcing us to look past our initial, instinctive impulses of anger and retribution to confront the fragile, unpredictable nature of the human brain. It is a stark reminder that severe mental illness does not care about social standing, religious devotion, or parental love, but can insidiously infiltrate a human mind until reality and delusion become indistinguishable. The tragedy of the Yates family stands as a permanent monument to the catastrophic cost of systemic failure, ignored medical warnings, and the devastating silence that so often surrounds maternal mental health. As we close this exploration, we are left with a sobering, profound reflection on the imperative of empathy, the absolute necessity of robust medical safety nets, and the sacred duty we share to protect the most vulnerable among us from the invisible demons that dwell within the human condition. As the years have continued to pass since the resolution of the legal battles and the quiet institutionalization of Andrea Yates, the broader landscape of American jurisprudence and forensic psychiatry has undergone a profound, irreversible transformation that directly traces its roots back to the harrowing events in Pasadena, Texas. The case served as an unprecedented stress test for the legal systems of the United States, exposing the dangerous vulnerabilities that emerge when rigid procedural standards collide with the complex, invisible realities of severe mental illness. Legal scholars, criminal defense attorneys, prosecutors, and judges alike were forced to reevaluate the ways in which the insanity defense is understood, argued, and evaluated within a court of law. For generations, the application of historical legal frameworks like the Manhattan Rule had often reduced profound psychiatric crises into simplistic binaries of good versus evil, sanity versus calculated malice. The Yates case shattered this oversimplified dichotomy, compelling the legal establishment to acknowledge that a mind consumed by severe postpartum psychosis operates under a completely different set of internal rules, where logical reasoning is replaced by absolute delusion and the capacity to perceive moral right is entirely fractured. This realization catalyzed a much-needed modernization in how forensic experts approach evaluations, emphasizing the necessity of rigorous scientific integrity, comprehensive medical history reviews, and an absolute resistance to the sensationalism or cultural biases that can so easily distort the pursuit of justice. The exposure of false testimony during the appellate process served as a grim warning to the judicial community, reinforcing the principle that the life and liberty of an individual, especially one battling a catastrophic psychiatric collapse, must never be compromised by fabricated narratives or theatrical expedients. Consequently, modern trials involving severe mental defect now demand a much higher standard of forensic accountability, ensuring that juries are presented with accurate, medically grounded evidence rather than emotionally charged conjectures. This evolution in legal philosophy did not excuse the horrific nature of the acts committed, but it established a more compassionate, scientifically informed mechanism for distinguishing between criminal culpability driven by malice and the tragic, devastating outcomes of untreated psychiatric disease. Beyond the courtroom and the hallowed halls of legal academia, the reverberations of this tragedy fundamentally reshaped the medical and scientific understanding of postpartum psychiatric disorders, bringing a once-hidden affliction out of the shadows of social stigma and into the forefront of public health policy. Before the events of June 20th, 2001, conditions such as postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis were frequently minimized, misunderstood, or shamefully swept under the rug, treated as private domestic struggles or personal emotional failures rather than medical emergencies requiring immediate, specialized intervention. The public revelation of the agonizing mental deterioration Andrea experienced forced a massive cultural reckoning, shattering the idealized, romanticized cultural myths surrounding motherhood that had long dictated that a mother's love alone should be sufficient to conquer any internal darkness. Medical institutions, advocacy groups, and public health officials began an extensive campaign to educate the public and the medical community about the biological realities of childbirth and the profound hormonal upheavals that can trigger a catastrophic break from reality. Obstetricians, pediatricians, and primary care physicians were re-educated to recognize that the postpartum period is a time of immense vulnerability, requiring proactive screening, continuous monitoring, and open, non-judgmental conversations about mental health. The medical establishment recognized that failing to screen for postpartum psychosis is not merely an administrative oversight, but a dangerous negligence that leaves vulnerable women entirely unprotected against a condition that can swiftly escalate from mild anxiety to complete cognitive collapse. Furthermore, support networks and specialized psychiatric units dedicated specifically to maternal mental health began to emerge across the country, providing safe havens where struggling mothers could receive intensive, compassionate care without the crushing weight of societal shame or fear of punitive judgment. These sweeping medical and institutional reforms ensured that the profound suffering experienced within the Yates household would serve as a powerful catalyst for saving countless other families from falling through the devastating cracks of an inadequately prepared healthcare system. As we examine the enduring legacy of this case, it is equally vital to reflect upon the profound societal shifts in empathy, compassion, and the collective understanding of human fragility that emerged from the ashes of this tragedy. For a long time, true crime narratives had a tendency to sensationalize horrific events, focusing exclusively on the morbid details and treating perpetrators as monolithic monsters while entirely ignoring the complex, multi-layered systemic failures that allowed such catastrophes to unfold. The story of Andrea Yates challenged this superficial approach, demanding that society confront the uncomfortable, deeply empathetic truth that the human brain is a fragile organ capable of profound, terrifying fractures that can reduce even the most dedicated, caring individuals to shadows of their former selves. People began to realize that severe mental illness does not discriminate based on socioeconomic status, educational background, or religious devotion, but can insidiously infiltrate a life until the boundaries between reality and absolute delusion are completely erased. This realization fostered a broader, more compassionate cultural dialogue surrounding mental health, encouraging individuals to speak openly about their internal struggles, seek professional help early, and dismantle the harmful stigmas that had long prevented people from admitting when they were drowning in psychological distress. The public learned to hold space for two seemingly contradictory truths at the very same time: the acknowledgement of an unimaginable, horrific tragedy that claimed 5 innocent lives, and the profound, compassionate recognition of a severely ill mother whose mind was entirely hijacked by an invisible disease beyond her control. This nuanced perspective transformed the way society engages with stories of true crime, shifting the focus away from mere sensationalism and toward a deeper, more analytical exploration of prevention, intervention, and the vital importance of mental health care accessibility. Yet, even as we analyze the legal precedents, medical reforms, and cultural evolutions that define the broader narrative, our reflections must inevitably return to the quiet, immutable core of the tragedy: the 5 young lives whose futures were so abruptly and senselessly extinguished on that fateful morning. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary remain the permanent, beating heart of this narrative, serving as a poignant reminder of the ultimate human cost of systemic failure and untreated illness. They were not merely footnotes in a legal textbook or abstract symbols of a broken healthcare system. They were vibrant, developing children with their own unique laughter, their own evolving curiosities, and their own boundless potential to shape the world around them. Noah, the protective older brother taking his first cautious steps into the wider world of education and growth. John, radiating the bright, kinetic energy of a 5-year-old discovering the wonders of his environment. Paul and Luke, navigating their toddler years with clumsy, beautiful innocence. And baby Mary, a fragile, 6-month-old infant whose brief existence was inextricably caught in the devastating storm of her mother's illness. The void left by their absence is absolute and enduring, a permanent scar on the fabric of their family and the collective consciousness of a community that will forever mourn the loss of such pure, unblemished potential. Their memories stand as a solemn, heartbreaking testament to the urgent necessity of remaining eternally vigilant in our protection of the vulnerable, ensuring that no family is ever again left to fight the dark, silent battles of severe mental illness in absolute isolation. In the quiet, secure confines of the Kerrville State Hospital in Texas, far removed from the glaring lights of the media and the relentless scrutiny of the public eye, Andrea Yates continues to live out her remaining days as a permanent resident of a specialized psychiatric institution. Her existence within the facility is characterized by routine medical supervision, therapeutic care, and the heavy, inescapable shadow of a reality that returned to her once the devastating fog of her postpartum psychosis finally lifted. Over the years, reports from medical professionals, legal advocates, and family members who have maintained contact indicate that she remains deeply withdrawn, carrying the profound, agonizing weight of comprehending the magnitude of what occurred during her psychotic break, demonstrating the absolute depth of her remorse and the irreversible impact of her condition. Andrea has consistently chosen to decline every opportunity to participate in hearings or evaluations that could potentially grant her conditional release or transition her into a less restrictive community environment. She has repeatedly elected to remain within the structured, therapeutic walls of the hospital, quietly accepting the institution as her permanent home and refusing to seek freedom for a life she feels she can no longer participate in, living instead as a haunting, living monument to the devastating consequences of untreated psychiatric collapse. Her quiet, isolated existence within the facility serves as a powerful, melancholic reminder that there are some psychological storms so absolute in their destruction that no amount of time or treatment can ever truly restore what was lost. As this comprehensive exploration of the Andrea Yates case draws to its final close, we are left with a sobering, profound reflection on the fragile nature of the human condition and our shared responsibility to protect one another from the invisible demons that can dwell within the mind. The tragedy in Pasadena, Texas, remains one of the most haunting, complex, and emotionally demanding chapters in modern true crime history, challenging our fundamental understanding of guilt, innocence, parenthood, and psychological vulnerability. It stands as a permanent monument to the catastrophic cost of ignored medical warnings, systemic gaps in maternal health care, and the devastating silence that so often surrounds severe postpartum psychiatric disorders. By examining the meticulous details of this case, from the ignored warnings and the fatal 1-hour window of isolation to the complex legal battles and the ultimate cultural awakening, we honor the memories of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. We are reminded that empathy is not a weakness, but an essential tool for understanding the darkest depths of human suffering, and that robust medical safety nets, unwavering vigilance, and accessible mental health care are the absolute bulwarks against tragedy. The story of Andrea Yates will forever endure as a solemn warning and a guiding light, urging society to look closer, listen harder, and care more deeply for the vulnerable minds struggling in the shadows, ensuring that we never lose sight of our sacred duty to protect the innocent and support those who are fighting battles we cannot see. As we continue our deep exploration into the profound legacy of the Andrea Yates case, we are inevitably confronted with the broader sociological and institutional questions that transcend the boundaries of a single courtroom or a single psychiatric facility. The ripple effects of that fateful morning in Pasadena, Texas, have spent over 2 decades reshaping how modern society interprets the darkest fringes of human psychological distress. When we look back at the trajectory of this case, we are forced to reckon with the uncomfortable reality that institutional safety nets are often constructed only after a catastrophic failure has already occurred. The tragedy of the Yates family laid bare the deep systemic vulnerabilities in how maternal mental health was monitored, evaluated, and treated at the turn of the 21st century. It exposed a dangerous cultural blind spot, a pervasive societal reluctance to acknowledge that the human brain, under the immense biological and hormonal siege of repeated childbirth, can fracture so completely that the most fundamental and primal instincts of motherhood can be entirely inverted by terrifying delusions. This realization has forced medical institutions, legal scholars, and public health advocates to continuously reevaluate the ways in which society protects vulnerable individuals before a crisis reaches an irreversible tipping point, transforming the narrative from one of isolated horror into a permanent, cautionary milestone for preventative psychiatric care. The evolution of forensic psychiatry in the wake of this landmark case cannot be overstated, as it fundamentally altered how expert witnesses, judges, and juries approach the complex intersection of severe mental illness and criminal accountability. For generations, the legal definition of insanity remained rigidly bound to historic frameworks that struggled to comprehend the nuanced, labyrinthine nature of psychotic delusions, often demanding that a defendant prove a total disconnect from reality in a manner that ignored the internal logic of a diseased mind. The intense national scrutiny brought upon the judicial system during both trials of Andrea Yates demonstrated the urgent need for absolute scientific integrity, rigorous peer review, and a complete rejection of theatrical or fabricated evidence within forensic evaluations. The harrowing discovery of false testimony during the appellate process served as a powerful, sobering reminder that the administration of justice cannot afford to compromise on factual accuracy, especially when dealing with individuals whose lives and liberties hang in the balance of a psychiatric diagnosis. Modern legal proceedings involving severe mental defect now operate under a heightened standard of scrutiny, demanding comprehensive documentation, independent expert consensus, and a deeper, more empathetic understanding of how severe postpartum psychosis can systematically dismantle a person's cognitive and moral faculties. This ongoing evolution in legal philosophy ensures that future courts are better equipped to navigate the murky waters of criminal culpability, striving to maintain a delicate balance between public safety and the compassionate recognition of profound mental illness. Yet, beyond the sterile confines of courtrooms and medical textbooks, the human element of this tragedy remains a heavy, inescapable presence that continues to haunt those who followed the case. The surviving members of the Yates family, particularly Rusty Yates, were forced to navigate an agonizingly complex aftermath, attempting to rebuild their lives in the suffocating shadow of an unimaginable loss. Rusty's public journey following the tragedy, marked by his eventual remarriage, subsequent divorce, and continued advocacy for mental health awareness, stands as a poignant illustration of the profound, lingering devastation left in the wake of untreated postpartum psychosis. He became an unexpected voice in the national conversation surrounding maternal mental health, speaking openly about the critical importance of recognizing the subtle, often masked warning signs of severe psychiatric deterioration. His experiences underscore the devastating toll that unmanaged illness takes not only on the individual experiencing the psychosis, but on the entire family ecosystem that surrounds them. The realization of what could have been done differently, the ignored medical warnings, the brief windows of unsupervised vulnerability, and the desperate cries for help that were drowned out by rigid ideological convictions, serves as an agonizing blueprint of missed opportunities for intervention. It is a stark reminder that when severe mental illness enters a household, it requires an active, coordinated, and uncompromising community of support to keep the fragile pieces from shattering completely. The landscape of maternal mental health care has experienced a significant, paradigm-shifting transformation over the subsequent decades, driven largely by the urgent lessons extracted from this profound tragedy. Healthcare providers across the globe have increasingly recognized that the postpartum period is not a uniform journey of blissful adjustment, but a highly volatile medical transition that demands proactive screening, compassionate listening, and continuous clinical oversight. Hospitals and obstetric practices have gradually integrated mandatory mental health evaluations into routine prenatal and postnatal care, ensuring that new mothers are screened for depressive symptoms, anxiety disorders, and psychotic tendencies before they reach a point of acute crisis. Furthermore, public awareness campaigns have worked tirelessly to dismantle the toxic stigmas that have historically forced struggling mothers to suffer in silence, terrified of admitting that they are drowning in the overwhelming demands of parenthood. Support groups, crisis hotlines, and specialized inpatient psychiatric units dedicated explicitly to maternal mental health have multiplied, providing safe, non-judgmental environments where women can receive intensive therapeutic intervention without the fear of immediate social ostracization or punitive judgment. These sweeping institutional reforms represent a collective determination to ensure that no other family is forced to endure the agonizing losses that define the Yates household, transforming a devastating historical failure into a powerful catalyst for systemic protection and healing. Within the secure, cloistered walls of the Kerrville State Hospital, Andrea Yates continues her quiet, indefinite existence as a permanent resident of a specialized psychiatric facility, living out her days far away from the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. Her daily routine is defined by medical supervision, therapeutic oversight, and the heavy, inescapable weight of a reality that eventually returned to her once the dense fog of her postpartum psychosis finally lifted. Over the years, reports from the medical professionals and legal advocates who have maintained consistent contact with her paint a picture of a deeply sorrowful, intensely withdrawn individual who carries the profound, agonizing realization of what occurred during her catastrophic mental collapse, demonstrating the absolute depth of her remorse and the irreversible impact of her condition. Andrea has consistently chosen to decline every opportunity to participate in hearings or evaluations that could potentially grant her conditional release or transition her into a less restrictive community environment. She has repeatedly elected to remain within the structured, therapeutic confines of the hospital, quietly accepting the institution as her permanent home and refusing to seek freedom for a life she feels she can no longer participate in, living instead as a haunting, living monument to the devastating consequences of untreated psychiatric collapse. Her quiet, isolated existence within the facility serves as a powerful, melancholic reminder that there are some psychological storms so absolute in their destruction that no amount of time, medication, or institutional care can ever truly restore what was lost. As we bring this extensive, multi-part exploration of the Andrea Yates case to its ultimate conclusion, we are left with a sobering, profound reflection on the fragile nature of the human condition and our shared responsibility to protect one another from the invisible demons that can dwell within the mind. The tragedy in Pasadena, Texas, remains one of the most haunting, complex, and emotionally demanding chapters in modern true crime history, challenging our fundamental understanding of guilt, innocence, parenthood, and psychological vulnerability. It stands as a permanent monument to the catastrophic cost of ignored medical warnings, systemic gaps in maternal health care, and the devastating silence that so often surrounds severe postpartum psychiatric disorders. By examining the meticulous details of this case, from the ignored warnings and the fatal one-hour window of isolation to the complex legal battles and the ultimate cultural awakening, we honor the memories of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. We are reminded that empathy is not a weakness, but an essential tool for understanding the darkest depths of human suffering, and that robust medical safety nets, unwavering vigilance, and accessible mental health care are the absolute bulwarks against tragedy. The story of Andrea Yates will forever endure as a solemn warning and a guiding light, urging society to look closer, listen harder, and care more deeply for the vulnerable minds struggling in the shadows, ensuring that we never lose sight of our sacred duty to protect the innocent and support those who are fighting battles we cannot see. As we stand at the culmination of this exhaustive and deeply emotional exploration into the tragedy of the Yates family, we are compelled to reflect upon how this specific case has cemented itself within the collective memory of modern society. Unlike many narratives within the true crime genre that focus on calculated malice, predatory cunning, or the dark corners of criminal enterprise, the story of Andrea Yates occupies a profoundly different, much heavier psychological space. It is a narrative defined not by the presence of evil intent, but by the devastating absence of safety nets, the catastrophic failure of medical warnings, and the terrifying, uncontrollable velocity of a mind completely fracturing under the immense pressure of severe postpartum psychosis. When we look back at the events of that fateful morning in Pasadena, Texas, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that true horror often arrives quietly, cloaked in the ordinary routines of domestic life, driven by invisible forces that conventional wisdom is entirely unequipped to understand or manage. The enduring legacy of this case lies in its capacity to challenge our most deeply ingrained cultural assumptions about motherhood, mental illness, and the fundamental responsibilities of a compassionate society toward its most vulnerable members, ensuring that the memory of what transpired remains a permanent, sobering touchstone for how we approach psychiatric care and legal accountability. The legal journey that stretched from the initial conviction in 2002 to the landmark insanity ruling in 2006 serves as a profound testament to the tortuous path of justice when it intersects with severe mental defect. It exposed the dangerous vulnerabilities of legal frameworks that are historically rigid and slow to adapt to the nuanced realities of psychiatric science, demonstrating how easily the pursuit of truth can be compromised by theatrical expedients, flawed expert testimony, and societal pressure for retribution. The ultimate recognition by the judicial system that Andrea was incapable of distinguishing moral right from wrong at the exact moment of the tragedy did not erase the immense sorrow of the outcome, but it restored a vital measure of intellectual and ethical integrity to the legal process. It established a critical legal precedent, ensuring that future courts would be forced to look past the visceral horror of a crime and meticulously examine the organic, biological roots of a defendant's psychological state. This evolution in forensic jurisprudence transformed the insanity defense from a mere legal loophole into a necessary mechanism of absolute justice, acknowledging that punishing an individual whose mind was entirely unmoored from reality serves neither the principles of deterrence nor the moral foundations of a civilized society, leaving behind a legacy that continues to guide how modern legal systems navigate the dark, uncharted waters of severe psychiatric collapse. Beyond the sterile arguments of legal scholars and the clinical assessments of psychiatrists, the human dimensions of this tragedy continue to cast a long, lingering shadow over everyone touched by its orbit. The surviving family members, particularly Rusty Yates, were left to navigate an agonizingly complex aftermath, forced to rebuild their lives in the suffocating shadow of a permanent loss while attempting to process the devastating interplay between their rigid religious ideologies and the clinical realities of mental illness. Rusty's subsequent journey into public advocacy, speaking out on the critical importance of recognizing the subtle, often masked warning signs of postpartum psychiatric distress, illustrates the painful, lifelong process of learning from catastrophic mistakes. His experiences stand as a powerful reminder that severe mental illness does not operate in a vacuum, but is deeply intertwined with the family ecosystems and social structures surrounding the individual. The agonizing realization of what could have been done differently, the ignored medical warnings, the brief windows of unsupervised vulnerability, and the desperate cries for help that were drowned out by ideological dogma, serves as a heartbreaking blueprint of missed opportunities for intervention. It underscores the vital truth that when severe mental illness enters a household, it requires an active, coordinated, and uncompromising community of support to keep the fragile pieces from shattering completely, a lesson that has since transformed how families and support systems approach the care of struggling mothers. Yet, even as we analyze the institutional reforms, the legal precedents, and the sociological shifts that define the broader narrative, our reflections must inevitably return to the quiet, immutable core of the tragedy. The 5 young lives whose futures were so abruptly and senselessly extinguished on that fateful morning. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary remain the permanent, beating heart of this narrative, serving as a poignant reminder of the ultimate human cost of systemic failure and untreated illness. They were not merely footnotes in a legal textbook or abstract symbols of a broken healthcare system. They were vibrant, developing children with their own unique laughter, their own evolving curiosities, and their own boundless potential to shape the world around them. Noah, the protective older brother taking his first cautious steps into the wider world of education and growth. John, radiating the bright, kinetic energy of a 5-year-old discovering the wonders of his environment. Paul and Luke, navigating their toddler years with clumsy, beautiful innocence. And baby Mary, a fragile, 6-month-old infant whose brief existence was inextricably caught in the devastating storm of her mother's illness. The void left by their absence is absolute and enduring, a permanent scar on the fabric of their family and the collective consciousness of a community that will forever mourn the loss of such pure, unblemished potential. Their memories stand as a solemn, heartbreaking testament to the urgent necessity of remaining eternally vigilant in our protection of the vulnerable, ensuring that no family is ever again left to fight the dark, silent battles of severe mental illness in absolute isolation. In the quiet, secure confines of the Kerrville State Hospital in Texas, far removed from the glaring lights of the media and the relentless scrutiny of the public eye, Andrea Yates continues to live out her remaining days as a permanent resident of a specialized psychiatric institution. Her existence within the facility is characterized by routine medical supervision, therapeutic care, and the heavy, inescapable shadow of a reality that returned to her once the devastating fog of her postpartum psychosis finally lifted. Over the years, reports from medical professionals, legal advocates, and family members who have maintained contact indicate that she remains deeply withdrawn, carrying the profound, agonizing weight of comprehending the magnitude of what occurred during her psychotic break, demonstrating the absolute depth of her remorse and the irreversible impact of her condition. Andrea has consistently chosen to decline every opportunity to participate in hearings or evaluations that could potentially grant her conditional release or transition her into a less restrictive community environment. She has repeatedly elected to remain within the structured, therapeutic walls of the hospital, quietly accepting the institution as her permanent home and refusing to seek freedom for a life she feels she can no longer participate in, living instead as a haunting, living monument to the devastating consequences of untreated psychiatric collapse. Her quiet, isolated existence within the facility serves as a powerful, melancholic reminder that there are some psychological storms so absolute in their destruction that no amount of time or treatment can ever truly restore what was lost. As this comprehensive exploration of the Andrea Yates case draws to its final close, we are left with a sobering, profound reflection on the fragile nature of the human condition and our shared responsibility to protect one another from the invisible demons that can dwell within the mind. The tragedy in Pasadena, Texas, remains one of the most haunting, complex, and emotionally demanding chapters in modern true crime history, challenging our fundamental understanding of guilt, innocence, parenthood, and psychological vulnerability. It stands as a permanent monument to the catastrophic cost of ignored medical warnings, systemic gaps in maternal health care, and the devastating silence that so often surrounds severe postpartum psychiatric disorders. By examining the meticulous details of this case, from the ignored warnings and the fatal one-hour window of isolation to the complex legal battles and the ultimate cultural awakening, we honor the memories of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. We are reminded that empathy is not a weakness, but an essential tool for understanding the darkest depths of human suffering, and that robust medical safety nets, unwavering vigilance, and accessible mental health care are the absolute bulwarks against tragedy. The story of Andrea Yates will forever endure as a solemn warning and a guiding light, urging society to look closer, listen harder, and care more deeply for the vulnerable minds struggling in the shadows, ensuring that we never lose sight of our sacred duty to protect the innocent and support those who are fighting battles we cannot see. As we finally arrive at the absolute closing chapter of this extensive, deeply immersive exploration into the tragedy of the Yates family, we find ourselves enveloped in a profound, heavy silence that seems to settle over the entire narrative. Over the course of our journey through the dark, labyrinthine corridors of this case, we have dismantled the layers of horror, examined the cold clinical records, navigated the rigid legal battlegrounds, and confronted the uncomfortable, sobering truths of severe postpartum psychiatric illness. True crime storytelling often tempts us to seek neat conclusions, to categorize individuals neatly into heroes and villains, or to find a simple moral lesson that can neatly wrap up an unimaginable catastrophe. Yet, as we stand at this final juncture, looking back across the years that have passed since that fateful morning in Pasadena, Texas, we realize that the story of Andrea Yates resists all such simple categorizations. It remains an open wound in the collective memory of modern society, a haunting, multi-layered tragedy defined not by a sudden explosion of malice or calculated wickedness, but by a catastrophic collision of ignored medical warnings, systemic failures, unyielding ideological pressures, and the terrifying, uncontrollable velocity of a human mind completely fragmenting under the weight of an invisible disease. The legacy of this case is not merely a legal precedent or a chapter in a psychiatric textbook. It is a permanent, enduring reminder of our shared human vulnerability and the devastating cost of failing to protect those who are drowning in psychological darkness. When we reflect upon the long and tortuous path that brought us from the quiet suburban home on June 20th, 2001, to the secure walls of the Kerrville State Hospital, we are reminded of the immense responsibility carried by the institutions designed to protect and serve the public. The journey through the initial conviction, the dramatic overturning of that sentence due to false expert testimony, and the historic insanity verdict of 2006 exposed the profound difficulties that arise when historical legal frameworks attempt to evaluate the complex, labyrinthine realities of severe mental defect. It taught the legal community a harsh, unforgettable lesson about the absolute necessity of scientific integrity, demanding that the administration of justice must never be compromised by theatrical expedients or fabricated narratives. The recognition by the BOI Tam Doan that Andrea was utterly incapable of distinguishing moral right from wrong at the exact moment of the tragedy did not erase the agonizing sorrow of the outcome, but it restored a vital measure of ethical balance to a judicial system struggling to comprehend how a mother could be simultaneously the perpetrator and the primary victim of a horrific act. This evolution in forensic jurisprudence ensured that future courts would be forced to look past the visceral horror of a crime and meticulously examine the organic, biological roots of a defendant's psychological state, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape how modern legal systems navigate the dark, uncharted waters of severe psychiatric collapse. Yet, beyond the sterile arguments of legal scholars and the clinical assessments of forensic psychiatrists, the human dimensions of this tragedy continue to cast a long, lingering shadow over everyone touched by its orbit. The surviving family members, particularly Rusty Yates, were left to navigate an agonizingly complex aftermath, forced to rebuild their lives in the suffocating shadow of a permanent loss, while attempting to process the devastating interplay between their rigid religious ideologies and the clinical realities of mental illness. Rusty's subsequent journey into public advocacy, speaking out on the critical importance of recognizing the subtle, often masked warning signs of postpartum psychiatric distress, illustrates the painful, lifelong process of learning from catastrophic mistakes. His experiences stand as a powerful reminder that severe mental illness does not operate in a vacuum, but is deeply intertwined with the family ecosystems and social structures surrounding the individual. The agonizing realization of what could have been done differently, the ignored medical warnings, the brief windows of unsupervised vulnerability, and the desperate cries for help that were drowned out by ideological dogma, serves as a heartbreaking blueprint of missed opportunities for intervention. It underscores the vital truth that when severe mental illness enters a household, it requires an active, coordinated, and uncompromising community of support to keep the fragile pieces from shattering completely, a lesson that has since transformed how families and support systems approach the care of struggling mothers. The landscape of maternal mental health care has experienced a significant, paradigm-shifting transformation over the subsequent decades, driven largely by the urgent lessons extracted from this profound tragedy. Healthcare providers across the globe have increasingly recognized that the postpartum period is not a uniform journey of blissful adjustment, but a highly volatile medical transition that demands proactive screening, compassionate listening, and continuous clinical oversight. Hospitals and obstetric practices have gradually integrated mandatory mental health evaluations into routine prenatal and postnatal care, ensuring that new mothers are screened for depressive symptoms, anxiety disorders, and psychotic tendencies before they reach a point of acute crisis. Furthermore, public awareness campaigns have worked tirelessly to dismantle the toxic stigmas that have historically forced struggling mothers to suffer in silence, terrified of admitting that they are drowning in the overwhelming demands of parenthood. Support groups, crisis hotlines, and specialized inpatient psychiatric units dedicated explicitly to maternal mental health have multiplied, providing safe, non-judgmental environments where women can receive intensive therapeutic intervention without the fear of immediate social ostracization or punitive judgment. These sweeping institutional reforms represent a collective determination to ensure that no other family is forced to endure the agonizing losses that define the Yates household, transforming a devastating historical failure into a powerful catalyst for systemic protection and healing. Within the secure, cloistered walls of the Kerrville State Hospital, Andrea Yates continues her quiet, indefinite existence as a permanent resident of a specialized psychiatric facility, living out her days far away from the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. Her daily routine is defined by medical supervision, therapeutic oversight, and the heavy, inescapable weight of a reality that eventually returned to her once the dense fog of her postpartum psychosis finally lifted. Over the years, reports from the medical professionals and legal advocates who have maintained consistent contact with her paint a picture of a deeply sorrowful, intensely withdrawn individual who carries the profound, agonizing realization of what occurred during her catastrophic mental collapse, demonstrating the absolute depth of her remorse and the irreversible impact of her condition. Andrea has consistently chosen to decline every opportunity to participate in hearings or evaluations that could potentially grant her conditional release or transition her into a less restrictive community environment. She has repeatedly elected to remain within the structured, therapeutic confines of the hospital, quietly accepting the institution as her permanent home and refusing to seek freedom for a life she feels she can no longer participate in, living instead as a haunting, living monument to the devastating consequences of untreated psychiatric collapse. Her quiet, isolated existence within the facility serves as a powerful, melancholic reminder that there are some psychological storms so absolute in their destruction that no amount of time, medication, or institutional care can ever truly restore what was lost. As we bring this extensive, multi-part exploration of the Andrea Yates case to its ultimate conclusion, we must inevitably return our focus to the quiet, immutable core of the tragedy. The 5 young lives whose futures were so abruptly and senselessly extinguished on that fateful morning. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary remain the permanent, beating heart of this narrative, serving as a poignant reminder of the ultimate human cost of systemic failure and untreated illness. They were not merely footnotes in a legal textbook or abstract symbols of a broken healthcare system. They were vibrant, developing children with their own unique laughter, their own evolving curiosities, and their own boundless potential to shape the world around them. Noah, the protective older brother taking his first cautious steps into the wider world of education and growth. John, radiating the bright, kinetic energy of a 5-year-old discovering the wonders of his environment. Paul and Luke, navigating their toddler years with clumsy, beautiful innocence. And baby Mary, a fragile, 6-month-old infant whose brief existence was inextricably caught in the devastating storm of her mother's illness. The void left by their absence is absolute and enduring, a permanent scar on the fabric of their family and the collective consciousness of a community that will forever mourn the loss of such pure, unblemished potential. Their memories stand as a solemn, heartbreaking testament to the urgent necessity of remaining eternally vigilant in our protection of the vulnerable, ensuring that no family is ever again left to fight the dark, silent battles of severe mental illness in absolute isolation. We honor their brief, beautiful lives by keeping their names alive in our reflections, ensuring that they are never forgotten in the grand expanse of true crime history. As we close the final chapter on this deeply harrowing series, we leave the listener with a sobering reminder of the fragile nature of the human condition, the vital necessity of unwavering empathy, and the sacred, shared duty we all carry to look closer, listen harder, and protect the innocent from the invisible demons that dwell within the human mind. As we venture further into this final extension of our deep, multi-part exploration into the tragedy of the Yates family, we are invited to look beyond the immediate confines of the courtroom and the hospital walls, casting our gaze toward the broader cultural and institutional horizon of the present day. The passage of time has a unique way of transforming raw, bleeding wounds into historical landmarks. Yet the echoes of June 20th, 2001, refuse to fade into quiet obscurity. Instead, They remain an insistent, haunting reminder of what happens when a society fails to recognize the invisible agony unfolding behind closed doors. When we examine the state of maternal mental health care today, more than 2 decades after the tragedy shook the foundations of American jurisprudence, we can trace a direct lineage from the suffering of Andrea Yates to the modern reforms that now protect countless families from a similar fate. The conversation surrounding postpartum psychiatric disorders has shifted dramatically from whispered shame and social stigmatization to an open, urgent public health priority. Medical professionals, researchers, and advocates have worked tirelessly to dismantle the archaic notion that motherhood is an instinctive shield against mental illness, replacing it with a compassionate, scientifically grounded understanding of the biological vulnerabilities that accompany childbirth. This transformation did not happen overnight, nor did it come easily. It was forged in the agonizing fires of a profound national trauma, demanding that our institutions acknowledge the terrifying reality of postpartum psychosis not as a moral failure, but as a critical medical emergency requiring immediate, specialized intervention. The legacy of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary lives on within every routine screening implemented in modern hospitals, every specialized support group established for struggling mothers, and every instance where a healthcare provider looks past a forced smile to ask the difficult, life-saving questions that can prevent a descent into darkness. The evolution of public empathy and societal discourse surrounding true crime and mental illness represents another profound shift that owes its origins, in part, to the agonizing complexities of this case. For generations, public reactions to horrific crimes were dominated by an immediate, visceral demand for retribution, a knee-jerk impulse to label perpetrators as irredeemable monsters while ignoring the systemic and psychological failures that permitted such catastrophes to unfold. The tragedy in Pasadena forced society to confront an uncomfortable, deeply unsettling truth: that the human mind is a profoundly delicate structure, capable of fracturing so completely that a mother who deeply loved her children could be manipulated by disease into committing the unthinkable. This realization challenged our collective capacity for empathy, forcing us to grapple with the harrowing nuance of a crime driven entirely by a detached, unyielding psychosis rather than malice or hatred. People learned to hold space for 2 seemingly contradictory realities at the very same time, recognizing the immense, irreparable horror of the loss while simultaneously acknowledging the profound, tragic illness of the woman who caused it. This nuanced perspective has gradually reshaped how society consumes and analyzes true crime narratives, steering the genre away from sensationalized exploitation and toward a deeper, more analytical exploration of prevention, systemic reform, and the vital importance of accessible mental health care. By refusing to reduce the narrative to a simple battle between good and evil, society has taken a crucial step toward understanding the complex, shadowed intersections of human biology and criminal accountability, ensuring that future tragedies are met not just with condemnation, but with a fierce, proactive commitment to healing and support. Within the legal landscape, the enduring impact of the Yates case continues to serve as an indispensable teaching tool for law students, forensic psychiatrists, and jurists navigating the treacherous waters of the insanity defense. The trials demonstrated with brutal clarity the catastrophic dangers of allowing theatrical expedients, flawed expert testimony, or public hysteria to infiltrate the sacred halls of justice. The exposure of false testimony during the appellate process became a legendary cautionary tale within legal ethics, reinforcing the absolute necessity of rigorous scientific integrity and unwavering factual accuracy when a person's life and liberty hang in the balance of a psychiatric evaluation. Modern legal proceedings involving severe mental defect now operate under a heightened standard of scrutiny, demanding comprehensive documentation, independent expert consensus, and a deeper, more empathetic appreciation of how severe psychosis can dismantle a person's cognitive and moral faculties. This ongoing evolution in legal philosophy ensures that future courts are better equipped to navigate the murky waters of criminal culpability, striving to maintain a delicate balance between public safety and the compassionate recognition of profound mental illness. The legal journey of Andrea Yates stands as a permanent monument to the tortuous path of justice when it intersects with severe mental defect, reminding every officer of the court that the pursuit of truth must always transcend the pressure for easy convictions or emotionally satisfying outcomes. It is a legacy that demands humility from those who sit in judgment, recognizing that the human brain can harbor storms so dark and destructive that conventional legal frameworks must constantly adapt to remain just, equitable, and scientifically informed. As we turn our thoughts once more to the individual lives caught in the center of this historical storm, we are reminded of the profound, lifelong resilience required by those left behind to pick up the broken pieces. The surviving family members, particularly Rusty Yates, were forced to navigate an agonizingly complex aftermath, attempting to rebuild their lives in the suffocating shadow of a permanent loss while processing the devastating interplay between their rigid religious ideologies and the clinical realities of mental illness. Rusty's subsequent journey into public advocacy, speaking out on the critical importance of recognizing the subtle, often masked warning signs of postpartum psychiatric distress, illustrates the painful, lifelong process of learning from catastrophic mistakes. His experiences stand as a powerful reminder that severe mental illness does not operate in a vacuum, but is deeply intertwined with the family ecosystems and social structures surrounding the individual. The agonizing realization of what could have been done differently, the ignored medical warnings, the brief windows of unsupervised vulnerability, and the desperate cries for help that were drowned out by ideological dogma, serves as a heartbreaking blueprint of missed opportunities for intervention. It underscores the vital truth that when severe mental illness enters a household, it requires an active, coordinated, and uncompromising community of support to keep the fragile pieces from shattering completely, a lesson that has since transformed how families and support systems approach the care of struggling mothers. Far away from the public eye, within the secure, cloistered walls of the Kerrville State Hospital in Texas, Andrea Yates continues her quiet, indefinite existence as a permanent resident of a specialized psychiatric facility, living out her days in a state of profound, institutionalized isolation. Her daily routine is defined by medical supervision, therapeutic oversight, and the heavy, inescapable weight of a reality that eventually returned to her once the dense fog of her postpartum psychosis finally lifted. Over the years, reports from the medical professionals and legal advocates who have maintained consistent contact with her paint a picture of a deeply sorrowful, intensely withdrawn individual who carries the profound, agonizing realization of what occurred during her catastrophic mental collapse, demonstrating the absolute depth of her remorse and the irreversible impact of her condition. Andrea has consistently chosen to decline every opportunity to participate in hearings or evaluations that could potentially grant her conditional release or transition her into a less restrictive community environment. She has repeatedly elected to remain within the structured, therapeutic walls of the hospital, quietly accepting the institution as her permanent home and refusing to seek freedom for a life she feels she can no longer participate in, living instead as a haunting, living monument to the devastating consequences of untreated psychiatric collapse. Her quiet, isolated existence within the facility serves as a powerful, melancholic reminder that there are some psychological storms so absolute in their destruction that no amount of time, medication, or institutional care can ever truly restore what was lost. As we finally bring this extensive, multi-part exploration of the Andrea Yates case to its ultimate, definitive conclusion, we must inevitably return our focus to the quiet, immutable core of the tragedy. The 5 young lives whose futures were so abruptly and senselessly extinguished on that fateful morning. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary remain the permanent, beating heart of this narrative, serving as a poignant reminder of the ultimate human cost of systemic failure and untreated illness. They were not merely footnotes in a legal textbook or abstract symbols of a broken healthcare system. They were vibrant, developing children with their own unique laughter, their own evolving curiosities, and their own boundless potential to shape the world around them. Noah, the protective older brother taking his first cautious steps into the wider world of education and growth. John, radiating the bright, kinetic energy of a 5-year-old discovering the wonders of his environment. Paul and Luke, navigating their toddler years with clumsy, beautiful innocence. And baby Mary, a fragile, 6-month-old infant whose brief existence was inextricably caught in the devastating storm of her mother's illness. The void left by their absence is absolute and enduring, a permanent scar on the fabric of their family and the collective consciousness of a community that will forever mourn the loss of such pure, unblemished potential. Their memories stand as a solemn, heartbreaking testament to the urgent necessity of remaining eternally vigilant in our protection of the vulnerable, ensuring that no family is ever again left to fight the dark, silent battles of severe mental illness in absolute isolation. We honor their brief, beautiful lives by keeping their names alive in our reflections, ensuring that they are never forgotten in the grand expanse of true crime history. As we close the final chapter on this deeply harrowing series, we leave the listener with a sobering reminder of cyclical human vulnerability, the vital necessity of unwavering empathy, and the sacred, shared duty we all carry to look closer, listen harder, and protect the innocent from the invisible demons that dwell within the human mind.